The storm had come without mercy. It swept across the Montana plains like God's own breath, freezing everything it touched. What had begun as gentle snowfall in the early afternoon had transformed into a howling white nightmare by dusk. The wind cut through the thickest coats, and the temperature dropped so swiftly that cattle caught in open pastures froze where they stood. Northridge, Montana had weathered many winters since its founding in 1862, but few could recall a storm arriving with such sudden ferocity, especially this early in the season. The small town of 300 souls had been unprepared despite the old-timers' warnings about the peculiar red sky that had painted the horizon at dawn. Mayor Edmund Franklin squinted through the relentless swirl of white, the lantern in his gloved hand offering barely enough light to see 10 feet ahead. Behind him, 3 other men struggled against the wind, their faces wrapped in scarves, their shoulders hunched against the punishing cold. "We should turn back," shouted Jacob Miller, the town's blacksmith, his voice barely carried over the howling wind. "No man could survive a night in this." The mayor shook his head stubbornly. Dr. Harrison was heading to the Morrison place when the storm hit. If he tried to take shelter, he didn't finish the thought. They all knew what happened to men caught in blizzards without proper shelter. They'd been searching for nearly 2 hours, following what they hoped was the doctor's usual route to outlying farms. The Morrison child had come down with a fever yesterday, and Dr. Ambrose Harrison, despite his 65 years, never hesitated to ride out to help a patient regardless of weather or distance. "There," shouted William Peterson, pointing to a dark shape beneath an ancient cottonwood tree. "I see something." The men rushed forward, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. The snow had drifted against the massive trunk, creating a natural windbreak where something or someone lay partially covered in white. Mayor Franklin reached the spot first, his lantern illuminating what they had all feared to find. Dr. Harrison lay on his side, curled slightly as if seeking warmth that never came. His medical bag was still clutched in his frozen fingers, the leather stiff with ice. His face, normally kind and weathered from decades of service, was now an unnatural blue-white, his eyes closed as if in sleep. "Too late," the mayor whispered, removing his hat despite the cold. He must have gotten disoriented in the whiteout. The men stood silent for a long moment, snow collecting on their shoulders, as they paid silent respect to the man who had delivered most of their children, set their broken bones, and guided them through every illness that had swept through Northridge over the past 30 years. "God rest his soul," said Peterson finally. "What will we do now? He was our only doctor." The mayor looked up at the endless swirl of white above them. "First we get him back to town. Then we pray this winter isn't as hard as its beginning." What none of them said aloud was the truth. They all knew the nearest doctor was in Cedar Falls, 2 days' ride in good weather. With winter closing in, Northridge was now dangerously vulnerable. A bad fever, a difficult childbirth, a serious injury, any of these could prove fatal without medical care. As they carefully wrapped the doctor's body in a blanket they'd brought, the storm continued its assault, uncaring of the small human tragedy playing out beneath the ancient cottonwood. By morning, the doctor's tracks would be completely erased, as if he had never existed at all. The news spread through Northridge before dawn. By the time the storm broke the following day, revealing a world transformed into crystalline white, the entire town knew they had lost more than just a beloved doctor. They had lost their safety net, their protection against the harsh realities of frontier life. What they didn't yet realize was that Dr. Harrison had taken many secrets to his frozen grave, secrets that would have changed everything for at least 2 people in their community. 3 days after the blizzard, the sun emerged to reveal a world encased in ice. Tree branches hung heavy and glittering, and the streets of Northridge had been transformed into rutted pathways of packed snow. Men worked to clear walkways, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air, while children delighted in the transformed landscape, sliding across frozen puddles and building snow forts. But the joy of children couldn't mask the somber mood that had settled over the town following Dr. Harrison's funeral. The small cemetery on the hill now held yet another victim of Montana's unforgiving elements, and the reality of their situation weighed heavily on everyone's mind. It was against this backdrop that Griffin Thorne made one of his rare appearances in town. He came from the northwest, leading his wagon with careful precision down the slippery main street. People stopped to watch. They always did when Griffin appeared. Standing 8 feet tall, he towered over everyone in the territory, his massive frame a sight that still caused newcomers to stop and stare. Today he drove slowly, mindful of three small passengers huddled under blankets in the back of his wagon. The Donovan children, ages 6, 8, and 10, had been caught in the storm's aftermath while searching for a lost calf. Griffin had found them 2 miles from town, their small bodies dangerously cold, their directions hopelessly confused in the featureless white landscape. Mr. Thorne found them by the creek. Mrs. Donovan was already telling neighbors as she rushed to meet the wagon. They were nearly frozen through. Griffin brought the wagon to a gentle stop in front of the general store. His enormous hands, which could easily bend horseshoes straight, handled the reins with surprising delicacy. He wore no gloves despite the cold, and his dark hair hung loose around a face that might have been handsome if it weren't so habitually solemn. "Sarah, Michael, Emma," Mrs. Donovan cried, reaching for her children. The smallest girl, Emma, looked up at Griffin with clear adoration. "Mr. Thorne made us hot tea from his special leaves," she announced importantly, "and he let us pet his horses." Griffin nodded slightly at Mrs. Donovan but said nothing. He rarely spoke in town unless it was absolutely necessary. Experience had taught him that his deep voice coupled with his intimidating size made people uncomfortable. "Thank you," Mrs. Donovan said, looking way up at Griffin. "If you hadn't found them," Griffin shifted uncomfortably. "Anyone would have done the same," he said quietly, his voice a deep rumble that belied his gentle nature. Stanley Walsh, the blacksmith, approached the wagon. "That was good of you, Thorne," he said with the easy familiarity of a man who had known Griffin for years. "Those little ones wouldn't have lasted another night out there." Griffin merely nodded again, eager to complete his business and return to his ranch. Whispering Pines lay 3 miles outside town, isolated enough that he could go weeks without seeing another human being exactly how he preferred it. "Supplies ready?" he asked Walsh, who nodded. "Martha's got everything packaged up at the house. She added extra coffee and sugar, thought you might need it after the storm." As Walsh helped unload Griffin's trading goods, exquisitely carved wooden items that sold well even in bigger towns like Cedar Falls, the blacksmith's wife appeared with several wrapped parcels. "Here's everything you requested, Griffin," Martha Walsh said kindly. Unlike many in town, she had never shown fear or discomfort around the giant man. "I added some of my apple preserves. Know how you like them." For a moment, the perpetual solemnity of Griffin's expression softened. "Thank you, Mrs. Walsh. I appreciate your thoughtfulness." Those who didn't know Griffin well might have missed the small wooden horse he pulled from his coat pocket, a beautifully detailed carving no bigger than a child's hand. He presented it to Emma Donovan with formal gravity. "For your bravery," he said simply. The little girl's eyes widened as she accepted the gift. "It looks just like your big horse," she exclaimed. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." Griffin's massive hand gently patted the child's head, a gesture so careful it was as if he feared she might break under his touch. Then, without further conversation, he loaded his supplies, nodded his goodbyes, and turned the wagon toward home. As he left town, few noticed his hand slip inside his pocket, where his fingers found another small wooden horse. Older, more worn, its details softened by years of handling. This one he never traded or gave away. It was the last gift his mother had given him before her death 5 years earlier, and he carried it always as both talisman and reminder. "I'll find someone who sees me, Mother," he whispered to himself, an oft-repeated promise. "Someone who doesn't fear what I am." But as the town receded behind him and the isolated landscape opened up ahead, Griffin knew the likelihood of fulfilling that promise grew slimmer with each passing year. At 32, he had long ago accepted that his unusual size made most people uncomfortable, at best frightened at worst. The solitude of Whispering Pines had become both his sanctuary and his prison. What Griffin couldn't know as he guided his team of massive draft horses homeward was that fate had already set in motion events that would test that promise in ways he could never have imagined. The schoolhouse bell rang precisely at 3 o'clock, its clear tone carrying across the snow-covered town square. Moments later, the single door burst open and releasing a flood of children who scattered like startled birds, their shouts and laughter filling the afternoon air. Sophia Winters stood in the doorway watching her students race toward home. At 43, she had been Northridge's only teacher for 8 years, educating everyone from frightened 5-year-olds to restless teenagers preparing for adult life. Her dark hair, streaked with dignified gray, was pulled back in a practical bun, and her hazel eyes missed little. "Remember your reading assignments?" she called after the retreating figures. 4 pages, not 2, Timothy Harrison. The red-headed boy waved acknowledgement without turning. Sophia smiled slightly. Timothy was Dr. Harrison's nephew and had inherited his uncle's quick mind, if not his dedication to detail. With a sigh, Sophia retreated into the schoolhouse. The single room was tidy, but worn with rows of simple desks facing a small blackboard. A pot-bellied stove radiated welcome heat in the corner, and bookshelves lined the back wall. Sophia's pride and joy assembled through years of careful collecting and occasional donations from passing travelers. She moved efficiently through her end-of-day routine, straightening desks, collecting forgotten items, banking the fire to last through the night. The familiar tasks allowed her mind to wander to the community meeting scheduled for that evening at the church. Dr. Harrison's death had left Northridge without medical care, and winter had barely begun. Someone would need to step forward, at least until spring allowed for travel to larger towns. The problem weighed heavily on her mind. As Sophia gathered her books and papers, her fingers brushed against the silver locket that hung around her neck. Without thinking, she opened it, revealing the small portrait of Thomas inside. 15 years had passed since consumption took him just 2 years into their marriage, but she still found herself seeking his face in moments of uncertainty. "What would you advise, Thomas?" she murmured, studying the handsome features captured in the tiny painting. They had been so young, so full of plans for the future plans that died along with him in that sanatorium back east. Closing the locket with a decisive snap, Sophia finished gathering her things. The dead offered no counsel and decisions belonged to the living. She had learned that lesson painfully over the years. The walk to her small house took less than 5 minutes. Unlike many frontier settlements, Northridge had been planned with care, its buildings arranged around a central square with the church at one end and the schoolhouse at the other. Sophia's cottage stood on a side street, its neat garden now buried under snow smoke, rising cheerfully from the chimney, thanks to Mrs. Peterson, who helped with household matters since Sophia spent most daylight hours teaching. "You're later than usual," Mrs. Peterson observed as Sophia entered. The older woman was stirring something fragrant on the stove. "Thought you might want hot soup before the meeting. Cold enough to freeze the whiskers off a cat out there." "Thank you, Ellen. That's very thoughtful." Sophia unwound her scarf and hung her heavy coat on the peg by the door. "Any news from town today?" Mrs. Peterson was Northridge's unofficial source of information, gathering gossip and news with remarkable efficiency despite her 70 years. She nodded, her expression turning serious. "That railroad man was back talking to Mayor Franklin. Transcontinental Railway, they call themselves. Fancy suits and fancier promises." She sniffed disapprovingly, "saying how they'll bring progress and prosperity if the town agrees to their route through the valley." Sophia frowned slightly. "This is the 3rd time they have sent representatives. They seem very determined." "Vultures, if you ask me," Mrs. Peterson declared, ladling soup into a bowl, "offering pennies for land worth dollars. The Wilkins already sold their place dirt cheap, I heard, and the Morrisons are considering it too, what with little Jenny's sickness and no doctor now to help." Sophia accepted the bowl with murmured thanks, her mind turning over this information. The railroad would change everything if it came through Northridge, for better or worse remained to be seen. Change was inevitable, she supposed, but something about the company's persistence troubled her. "Did you hear about Griffin Thorne?" Mrs. Peterson continued, never one to let a silence last too long. "Found the Donovan children half frozen by Willow Creek. Brought them back safe as can be." "Did he?" Sophia's interest was genuine. She had always been curious about the solitary giant who rarely came to town. "That was fortunate. Those children could have died out there. Martha Walsh says he's got the gentlest hands she's ever seen for a man his size. Makes those wooden carvings so fine you'd think they might breathe and move." Mrs. Peterson shook her head wonderingly. "Strange man, though. Hardly speaks 2 words together when he comes to town." Sophia had seen Griffin Thorne perhaps a dozen times in her 8 years in Northridge. Each time she had been struck by the careful way he moved, as if constantly aware that the world was too small and fragile for his frame. There was something about his solitude that resonated with her, though she would never have admitted as much to Mrs. Peterson or anyone else. "I should prepare for the meeting," Sophia said, finishing her soup. "Thank you for the meal." After Mrs. Peterson departed, Sophia moved to her small desk by the window. From the bottom drawer, she removed a stack of medical texts, gifts that had arrived mysteriously over the years, always addressed simply to S. Winters Northridge. She had her suspicions about their source, but Dr. Harrison had always deflected her questions with a twinkle in his eye. She ran her fingers over the embossed leather cover of Gray's Anatomy. These books, along with countless conversations with Dr. Harrison, had given her a knowledge of medicine unusual for a school teacher. Not comprehensive enough to replace a trained physician, certainly, but perhaps enough to help in the coming months. The light was fading outside her window, the short winter day already surrendering to darkness. Sophia lit the lamp on her desk and opened the book, allowing herself one more hour of study before she would need to leave for the church meeting where Northridge would decide how to face the uncertain future without its doctor. What she couldn't know, was how deeply her own future would become entwined with decisions made that night. The church bells chimed 7 times, calling the residents of Northridge to the emergency town meeting. Oil lamps illuminated the white-clappered building from within, casting long shadows across the snow-covered churchyard as people hurried inside their breath-forming clouds in the frigid evening air. Sophia arrived early, nodding greetings to families she had taught over the years. Nearly everyone in town had passed through her classroom at some point, giving her a unique perspective on the community. She chose a seat near the front beside Martha Walsh, who smiled warmly in welcome. "Cold night for a meeting," Martha observed, making room on the wooden pew. "Though I suppose it couldn't wait." "No," Sophia agreed quietly. "Winter's only just beginning." The church filled quickly. Mayor Franklin stood at the pulpit conferring in low tones with Pastor Bennett and Sheriff Montgomery. The concerned expressions on their faces confirmed what everyone already knew: the situation was serious. "Folks," the mayor began once the murmuring had died down, "thank you for coming out tonight. As we all know, we lost a good man and our only doctor when Ambrose Harrison was taken by the storm 3 days ago." Heads nodded solemnly throughout the congregation. Many still wore black armbands in mourning. "Cedar Falls is our nearest medical help, 2 days' ride in good weather," the mayor continued. "With winter closing in, that might as well be 100 miles. We need to discuss how we're going to manage until spring thaw." Sheriff Montgomery stepped forward. "I've sent telegrams to Bozeman and Helena asking if any doctors might be willing to relocate, but we shouldn't count on it. Few physicians want to start over in a small town, especially midwinter." A murmur of concern rippled through the crowd. Pregnancy accidents, illness, life didn't pause for convenience. "What about Dr. Harrison's supplies?" someone called from the back. "Medicines and such." The mayor nodded. "His nephew Timothy will inherit the practice eventually, but the boy's only 15 and years away from medical training. The supplies are being inventoried, but without someone who knows how to use them properly." The implications hung heavily in the air. Medical supplies without knowledge could be worse than useless. They could be dangerous. Stanley Walsh, the blacksmith, rose to his feet. He was a barrel-chested man with arms like tree trunks, from years at the forge, respected for both his strength and his straightforward manner. "I've got a suggestion," he said, his deep voice carrying easily in the church. "Miss Winters." All heads turned toward Sophia, who felt a sudden rush of heat to her face. "Dr. Harrison always said you had a doctor's mind," Walsh continued. "I've seen you helping him with patients before. You've got knowledge and people trust you with their children already." Sophia found herself speechless as murmurs of consideration spread throughout the church. True, she had assisted Dr. Harrison occasionally, and their discussions of medical texts had given her more knowledge than most, but to step into his role even temporarily. "I'm not a trained physician," she finally managed. "I've read some books, yes, and Dr. Harrison was kind enough to share his knowledge, but that hardly qualifies me to—" "No one's suggesting you perform surgeries," the mayor interjected. "But you know more than most about fevers and common ailments. You could assess what needs immediate attention and what can wait." Pastor Bennett nodded encouragingly. "It would be temporary, Miss Winters, just until we can secure a proper physician." Sophia looked around at the expectant faces. These were people she had taught, families she had known for years. She saw fear in their eyes, fear of facing a harsh winter without medical care, of children falling ill with no help available, of accidents, with no one to set bones or stitch wounds. She began, then paused, gathering her thoughts. "I will do what I can, though I must emphasize my limitations. I'm a teacher, not a doctor." Relief visibly swept through the assembly. Mayor Franklin smiled for the first time that evening. "Thank you, Miss Winters. That's all anyone could ask. Now, as to Dr. Harrison's supplies." The meeting continued with practical matters of inventory and emergency procedures discussed at length. Sophia listened attentively, though part of her mind was already cataloging what she knew, and more importantly, what she didn't know about treating various conditions. As the meeting drew to a close, Caroline Walsh leaned close to whisper in Sophia's ear. Did you hear about the Transcontinental Railway men back again, offering to buy up land? Sophia nodded. Mrs. Peterson mentioned it. Third visit in 2 months, apparently. Caroline's expression darkened. They're not just talking to the mayor anymore. They've been approaching farm owners directly, especially those struggling after the bad harvest, offering quick cash but not fair prices. That seems aggressive. Sophia observed something about the timing, raising her suspicions. Stanley says they're determined to run their line through this valley whatever it takes. Says they've got investors back east who won't take no for an answer. Carolyn glanced around before continuing in an even lower voice. And there's something else. The man leading them, I overheard the mayor call him Mr. Sterling. From Chicago, apparently. The name sent an unexpected chill through Sophia that had nothing to do with the winter air. Sterling was not an uncommon name, she reminded herself. It couldn't possibly be related to Thomas's family. I'm sure it's just business, Sophia said more to herself than to Carolyn. The railroad has been pushing westward for years. Caroline didn't look convinced, but nodded anyway. Perhaps. Just thought you should know with you taking on this new responsibility. People might be making decisions about their land based on medical concerns. The church was emptying now, families hurrying home through the cold night. Sophia gathered her shawl around her shoulders, her mind heavy with the weight of her new obligations. Miss Winters, Pastor Bennett called, approaching with a large leather bag. Dr. Harrison's medical kit. Sheriff thought you should have it right away in case of emergencies. Sophia accepted the worn bag, feeling the responsibility it represented settle onto her shoulders like a physical weight. Thank you, Pastor. I'll study its contents carefully. God bless you for stepping forward, he said kindly. I know it wasn't what you planned, but sometimes the Lord places us where we're needed most. Sophia managed a smile, though the religious sentiment offered little comfort to her practical mind. It wasn't God who had placed this burden on her shoulders, but circumstance and necessity. Outside, the night had grown even colder, stars pricking the black sky with fierce brilliance. Sophia walked slowly, the medical bag heavy in her hands, wondering what challenges the coming winter would bring, and whether she was truly prepared to face them. Sophia's cottage seemed especially quiet that night. The meeting had left her mind racing with concerns and responsibilities, making sleep impossible despite the late hour. After brewing a cup of chamomile tea, she settled at her small desk, the oil lamp casting a warm circle of light in the otherwise darkened room. Dr. Harrison's medical bag sat before her, its worn leather speaking of decades of service. She had opened it briefly after returning home, cataloging its contents. Stethoscopes, surgical instruments, bandages, vials of medicines she would need to identify, and a small notebook filled with the doctor's cramped handwriting patient notes and treatment reminders. Now setting her tea aside, Sophia reached for the silver locket that hung at her throat. It had become such a part of her daily attire that she sometimes forgot its presence until moments like this, when uncertainty made her seek connection to the past. The tiny hinges creaked slightly as she opened it, revealing Thomas's face in miniature. The portrait had been painted during their brief courtship in Chicago, capturing his gentle smile and thoughtful eyes. He had been 27, then she 25, both of them full of dreams for the future. What would you think of me now, Thomas? She whispered. A school teacher, playing at being a doctor in a frontier town you never even saw. The painted face offered no answer, of course. Thomas had died before they could journey west, his dreams of practicing law in the new territories dying with him in that sterile sanatorium room. Sophia had made the journey alone 2 years later, seeking distance from painful memories and the suffocating pity of his wealthy family. For 15 years, she had worn this locket daily, a talisman against forgetting. But tonight, as she studied the familiar features, Sophia was struck by a realization the face in the portrait had become more symbol than memory. She could recall the weight of the locket more easily than the weight of Thomas's hand in hers. With sudden decision, Sophia unclasped the chain from around her neck. The silver felt cool against her palm as she stared at it in the lamplight. Then deliberately, she closed the locket and placed it in the small carved bond on her desk. The first time in 15 years, it would not rest against her heart while she slept. I think it's time, Thomas, she said softly to the empty room. Time to truly live again. The gesture felt both terrifying and liberating, a private acknowledgement that the past, while honored, should no longer define her future. Tomorrow she would begin a new chapter, taking on responsibilities that would require all her focus and energy. Sophia turned her attention to the medical texts stacked neatly on her desk. Opening Gray's Anatomy, she began reviewing the chapters on common winter ailments, pneumonia, frostbite, influenza, making notes in her precise handwriting. If she was to serve as Northridge's medical caretaker, even temporarily, she would need to refresh and expand her knowledge. Hours passed as she studied the oil in the lamp burning low. Outside, the temperature continued to drop, ice crystals forming intricate patterns on her window panes. The world beyond her small circle of lamplight was frozen and still, but within it, Sophia Winters was transforming, preparing herself to step beyond the safe boundaries of her established life. What she could not know was how much further that transformation would take her before winter's end. The storm had passed, but bitter cold remained in its wake. Griffin worked methodically in the corral behind his barn, his breath forming clouds that were quickly whipped away by the sharp wind. For him, a wild mare paced nervously, her coat the color of wet slate, her dark eyes rolling with suspicion at every movement. She was young and strong, captured from one of the wild herds that still roamed the Montana highlands. Most would have called her untrainable, too wild, too set in her ways, but Griffin saw something in her fierce independence that spoke to him. He had named her Tempest for the storm of her spirit, and for 3 weeks he had been working patiently to earn her trust. "Easy now," he murmured, his deep voice pitched low and soothing. "No one's going to hurt you here." His enormous hands held a rope loosely, giving the mare space to circle. Griffin never used force with animals. He didn't need to. Something in his quiet patience eventually won them over, as if they recognized a kindred wildness beneath his controlled exterior. Behind him, the rest of Whispering Pines spread out in winter stillness. The main house was modest, but solidly built, its log walls and stone chimney testament to Griffin's skill as a craftsman. The barn was larger, designed to accommodate his unusual height, with stalls for 6 horses and storage for winter feed. A workshop stood nearby where he created the carvings that provided his secondary income. It was a solitary life, but a peaceful one. Griffin had built it carefully over the past decade, since inheriting the land after his mother's death. Clara Thorne had been a small woman with an indomitable will, raising her unusual son alone after his father abandoned them shortly after Griffin's birth. She had taught him many things: how to carve wood, how to gentle wild horses, how to find medicinal plants in the forest, but most importantly, she had taught him his own worth in a world that saw only his strangeness. "People fear what they don't understand," she had told him countless times. "That's their burden, not yours." A sudden gust of wind carried the scent of more snow, distracting Griffin momentarily. Tempest seized the opportunity, charging forward with unexpected speed. Her shoulder slammed into his chest, knocking him backward despite his size. As Griffin stumbled, his boot caught on an icy patch, sending him crashing into the corral fence with enough force to splinter the heavy posts. Pain exploded through his left side as he hit the ground. Something was broken: ribs, certainly, possibly his arm as well. Warm wetness spread across his shirt where jagged wood had pierced his skin. Griffin tried to rise, but found the world spinning alarmingly around him. Tempest had retreated to the far side of the corral, watching warily as the giant man struggled to his knees. Blood stained the snow beneath him crimson. "Not your fault, girl," Griffin managed, his voice tight with pain. "My mistake. Wasn't paying attention." He needed to get to the house, to his medical supplies. The bleeding wasn't fatal, but in this cold with night approaching, even a man of his size could succumb to exposure. Gritting his teeth, Griffin pulled himself upright, using the broken fence for support. Each breath sent daggers of pain through his chest, confirming his suspicion about broken ribs. He had made it halfway to the house when he heard the approaching hoofbeats. Someone was riding hard toward his ranch, unusual at any time, unheard of in this weather and at this hour. Griffin paused, one hand pressed against his bleeding side, the other braced against a fence post for support. The rider emerged from the tree line, a small figure bundled against the cold, urging a chestnut mare to greater speed. As they drew closer, Griffin recognized Caroline Walsh, the blacksmith's wife. "Mr. Thorne," she called, pulling her horse to a stop and dismounting with surprising agility for a woman in her 50s. "Dear God, you're hurt," Griffin nodded, finding speech difficult through the pain. "Accident. With the mare, he managed. Caroline assessed the situation quickly, her practical nature taking over. I was on my way to fetch Miss Winters. She's taken over medical duties since Dr. Harrison passed. Saw the accident from the road. She moved to support him, though her shoulder barely reached his mid-chest. Can you make it to the house? Miss Winters, Griffin repeated, confusion momentarily overriding pain. The school teacher was now providing medical care. There's no time to explain. You're bleeding badly, and this cold will kill you if we don't get you inside. Carolyn's tone brooked no argument. I'll ride for her immediately. Try to get to your bed if you can. The journey to the house seemed endless, each step sending fresh waves of agony through Griffin's body. By the time he reached his door, his vision was tunneling alarmingly. He managed to stoke the fire and collapse onto a chair before darkness claimed him. He woke to the sound of his door opening, cold air rushing in from outside. A lantern bobbed in the darkness, illuminating a slender figure wrapped in a heavy cloak. Mr. Thorne, the voice was clear and firm, a teacher's voice accustomed to maintaining order. Caroline Walsh said you've been injured. I've come to help. Griffin struggled to focus as Sophia Winters stepped into the light. He had seen her in town occasionally, but never spoken to her directly. Now she was in his home, her face flushed from the cold, a determined expression in her hazel eyes as she surveyed his bloodied form. Bad timing, he said through gritted teeth. Storm's coming again. Sophia was already removing her cloak, revealing a practical dress beneath. She carried a leather medical bag that he recognized as Dr. Harrison's. Let's worry about your injuries first, she said briskly. Then we can concern ourselves with the weather. As if in answer, the wind howled more fiercely outside, rattling the windows in their frames. The promised storm was arriving sooner than expected, its intensity suggesting they might both be trapped at Whispering Pines until it passed. I need to examine your wounds. Sophia continued, seemingly undeterred by either his size or the worsening weather. Can you remove your shirt, or shall I cut it away? Griffin tried to straighten but gasped as fresh pain lanced through his side. May need to cut it, he admitted. She nodded, retrieving scissors from the medical bag. To Griffin's surprise, she showed no hesitation in approaching him, no sign of the discomfort most people exhibited in his presence. Her hands were steady as she carefully cut away the bloodied fabric, revealing the full extent of his injuries. 3 broken ribs, I suspect, she said after a careful examination. And this gash will need stitching. You're fortunate, an inch to the left, and it would have punctured your lung. Griffin watched her face as she worked, fascinated by her clinical detachment. Most women would have been flustered by the intimate nature of tending to a half-naked man, especially one of his unusual proportions. Yet Sophia Winters displayed only professional concern, her touch gentle but confident as she cleaned his wounds. You've done this before, he observed. She glanced up briefly, meeting his eyes. I assisted Dr. Harrison occasionally. He was kind enough to share his knowledge. A small self-deprecating smile touched her lips. Though I'm certainly not qualified for this. Doing fine so far, Griffin assured her, then winced as she began sterilizing the wound with alcohol. This will need stitches, she warned. I have laudanum in the bag if you'd prefer to be sedated. Griffin shook his head. No need, I can tolerate pain. Sophia raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. As she prepared the needle and catgut, Griffin found himself studying her more closely. There was a quiet strength in her movements, a self-possession that reminded him of his mother. Both women small in stature but large in spirit. Outside, the storm intensified, snow pelting against the windows like tiny fists demanding entry. The wind found every crack and crevice in the cabin, making the flames in the fireplace dance and flicker. Looks like you may be stuck here tonight, Griffin said as Sophia positioned herself to begin stitching. Sorry for the inconvenience. She threaded the curved needle with practiced efficiency. Not your fault. Now try to hold still. This will hurt. The needle pierced his skin, and Griffin focused on his breathing, determined not to flinch under her careful ministrations. As she worked, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind, and within those sounds, the beginning of something neither of them could yet recognize. A connection being forged through pain and necessity, a twist of fate that would change both their lives forever. The storm grew more violent as the evening deepened, wind shrieking around the cabin's eaves like a living thing seeking entry. Sophia worked methodically, her world narrowed to the task of repairing Griffin's injuries. The firelight cast dancing shadows across his torso, highlighting the massive expanse of muscle and the damage done by the corral fence. Almost finished, she said, knotting another stitch. The wound was deep but clean, and her work was neat and precise. You'll need to keep this dry and clean to prevent infection. Griffin had remained remarkably still throughout the procedure, his breathing controlled despite what must have been considerable pain. Sophia had treated many patients as Dr. Harrison's assistant, but never one so stoic or so physically imposing. Even-seated Griffin Thorne was enormous, his shoulders broader than most door frames, his hands large enough to encircle her waist with room to spare. Yet there was nothing threatening in his presence. If anything, he seemed conscious of taking up too much space, of being too noticeable in a world built for smaller beings. "Thank you," he said quietly as she snipped the final thread. "Not many would venture out in this weather, especially to help someone like me." Something in his tone, a resignation, an acceptance of being considered somehow less worthy of aid, made Sophia pause in her work. "Someone like you," she repeated, meeting his dark eyes directly. "You mean someone injured and in need of medical attention?" A flicker of surprise crossed his solemn features, followed by something that might have been appreciation. "Most people find me unsettling," he said carefully. "Most people are fools, then," Sophia replied with unexpected vehemence. She began wrapping clean bandages around his torso to stabilize the broken ribs. "Size is hardly a measure of character, Mr. Thorne. I've taught children for 15 years. Some of the smallest have the meanest spirits, and some of the largest have the gentlest hearts." As she secured the bandage, her eyes were drawn to a shelf of books against the far wall. Not the cheap dime novels one might expect in a bachelor's cabin, but serious volumes. Medical texts, botanical references, and several titles she recognized from Dr. Harrison's own collection. "You're interested in medicine?" she asked, nodding toward the books. Griffin followed her gaze, a flicker of something like embarrassment crossing his features. "Just trying to understand things. Living alone, it helps to know how to care for injuries and illnesses." Sophia moved to the shelf, her curiosity piqued. The collection was extensive and well used, the spines cracked from repeated reading. One volume in particular caught her eye, a rare text on herbal remedies that Dr. Harrison had once mentioned seeking for years. "This is quite a library," she observed. "Some of these books are difficult to obtain, even in larger cities." Griffin shifted uncomfortably, then winced as the movement pulled at his fresh stitches. "I've collected them over time. Ordered some from back east, others were gifts." Sophia turned to face him, her clinical assessment giving way to genuine interest. "Did you always want to be a rancher, Mr. Thorne?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He was silent for so long that Sophia thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his deep voice was softer than before. "I wanted to be a doctor, since I was a boy." He looked down at his massive hands as if seeing them through others' eyes. "I applied to medical school in Chicago when I was 18. They rejected me without an interview." "Because of your size?" Sophia asked, though she already knew the answer. Griffin nodded. "The letter said they didn't believe I could perform delicate procedures with hands better suited to manual labor. They suggested I pursue more appropriate occupations." Indignation flared in Sophia's chest. "That's absurd. I've seen your wood carvings in the general store. They're incredibly detailed, far more delicate than most surgical work." A ghost of a smile touched Griffin's lips. "My mother said much the same thing. She encouraged me to study anyway, to learn what I could from books, if not from professors." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." She was. The simple past tense contained volumes of loss. Outside, the storm reached new heights of fury, a particularly strong gust rattling the entire cabin. The fire flickered dangerously in the draft. "You should sit by the fire," Griffin said, attempting to rise. "I can sleep in the—" "You will do no such thing," Sophia interrupted firmly. "You have 3 broken ribs and a significant wound. You need to remain still and warm." "But you—" "I am perfectly capable of making myself comfortable in that chair," she said, pointing to the well-worn armchair near the hearth. "Now, have you eaten anything today?" Griffin seemed taken aback by her authoritative tone, the same one she used with the recalcitrant students, but he settled back into his seat. "Not since morning," he admitted. "Then I'll make us both something. Where do you keep your provisions?" As Sophia busied herself in the small kitchen area, she became aware of how the cabin had been modified to accommodate its owner's unusual height. Counters were higher than standard door frames, had been extended upward, and the furniture was all custom-built for a man of Griffin's proportions. She found a pot and ingredients for a simple stew, working efficiently in the unfamiliar space. As she chopped vegetables, a small wooden object on the shelf above the stove caught her eye, a beautifully carved horse similar to those Griffin sold in town, but slightly more worn, as if handled often. "That was my mother's," Griffin said, noticing her interest. "The last thing I carved for her before she died." Sophia nodded, recognizing the personal value of such mementos. "It's beautiful work. She taught me to carve when I was small before I was this size," Griffin explained. "Said it would teach me patience and control, that creating beautiful things was a way of adding good to the world." As the stew began to simmer, filling the cabin with savory aromas, Sophia found herself drawn to a different shelf, this one filled with glass jars of various herbs and dried plants, each meticulously labeled in a precise hand. "You're a herbalist as well?" she asked, examining the collection. Griffin nodded. "My mother knew a great deal about plants and their properties. She passed that knowledge to me. Some work better than conventional medicines for certain conditions." Dr. Harrison thought similarly, Sophia said, surprised by this common ground. "He often combined traditional medicine with herbal remedies, especially for pain management." "You knew him well." Sophia stirred the stew, considering her answer. "He was a friend as well as a colleague. We shared an interest in medical advancement, in finding better ways to help people." She didn't mention the anonymous medical texts that had appeared on her doorstep over the years, books she had long suspected came from Dr. Harrison. Now seeing Griffin's extensive library, she wondered if the doctor had been encouraging two students all along. As the stew cooked, they fell into surprisingly easy conversation about medical topics, treatments for common ailments, the properties of various herbs, new research from Eastern universities. Griffin revealed a depth of knowledge that impressed Sophia, his self-education clearly thorough and ongoing. "You would have made an excellent doctor," she said, finally serving the stew in wooden bowls she'd found on a high shelf. "Those medical schools were foolish to reject you." Griffin accepted the bowl with careful hands, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps, or perhaps I was meant for this life instead." He gestured vaguely at the cabin around them. "Well, everyone is suited for town living." "By choice or by circumstance?" Sophia asked before she could stop herself. Their eyes met across the small table, and something shifted in the air between them, a recognition perhaps of kindred isolation. Both had chosen solitude for different reasons. Both had built lives apart from the expectations of others. "Both, I think," Griffin answered finally. "Though sometimes I wonder what my life might have been if—" He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. Sophia understood regret, understood the weight of paths not taken and dreams deferred. The storm continued unabated outside, but within the cabin a different kind of weather was brewing, a warming of the careful distance both had maintained from the world, a thawing of defenses long held in place. Later, neither would be able to say exactly how it happened. Perhaps it was the isolation of the storm, creating an intimate bubble outside of normal time and social constraints. Perhaps it was the vulnerability of injury and healing, breaking down carefully constructed walls. Or perhaps it was simply two lonely souls recognizing something in each other that they had long sought without knowing. Whatever the cause, when Griffin finally spoke of his mother's dying wish, that he find someone who could see past his exterior to the man within, Sophia found herself sharing her own carefully guarded pain, the loss of Thomas, the suffocation of pity from his family, her flight to the West to rebuild a life on her own terms. "I wear his image in a locket," she admitted, her hand going automatically to her throat before remembering she had left it behind that morning. "Or I did for 15 years. Just yesterday I took it off for the first time." "Why, bro?" Griffin asked softly. Sophia met his gaze steadily. "Because it was time to live in the present, not the past. Time to be more than the woman who lost her husband." The fire burned low as they talked, the hours slipping away unnoticed. When Sophia finally rose to add more wood to the hearth, she found herself unexpectedly unsteady, the warmth of the cabin and the intimacy of their conversation having lowered her guard. Griffin reached out to steady her, his large hand gentle on her arm. The contact was brief but electric, sending an unexpected current through both of them. When their eyes met this time, something fundamental had changed. "I should—" Sophia began, but the words died in her throat. "Yes." Griffin's voice was barely above a whisper, deep and resonant in the quiet cabin. What happened next would alter the course of both their lives, a moment of connection neither had sought, but both had perhaps unconsciously longed for. In the isolation of the storm-besieged cabin, with the wind howling, a wild counterpoint outside, two souls accustomed to solitude discovered the profound relief of being truly seen by another. And in that discovery, the first seeds of both healing and future complications were sown. Morning arrived with blinding brightness, the storm having passed during the night to leave a world transformed by fresh snow and merciless sunlight. Sophia woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings. She was curled in an oversized armchair, a thick quilt tucked carefully around her shoulders. Memory returned in a rush, the injured giant, the storm, the unexpected intimacy that had bloomed between them as the night deepened. Heat rose to her cheeks as she recalled how comfortable she had felt in Griffin's presence, how naturally conversation had flowed between them, and how that conversation had eventually given way to something more. Griffin himself was nowhere to be seen, though the cabin bore evidence of his presence. The fire had been recently stoked, and the aroma of fresh coffee filled the small space. Sophia rose, smoothing her rumpled dress as best she could, and moved to the window. Outside, the world sparkled pristine and silent. The storm had left at least a foot of fresh snow, transforming whispering pines into a scene from a fairy tale. In the distance, she could see Griffin moving slowly toward the barn, his massive form unmistakable against the white landscape. He moved carefully, one arm pressed protectively against his bandaged side. Sophia watched him for a moment, her emotions in turmoil. What had happened between them had been unexpected, unplanned, a connection neither had sought, but both had welcomed in the isolation of the storm. Now, in the harsh light of morning, she wasn't sure what it meant or how to proceed. She was still standing at the window when Griffin returned, stomping snow from his boots before entering. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment neither spoke. "I fed the horses," he said finally, his deep voice carefully neutral. "Road to town should be passable by midday." "Thank you," Sophia replied, equally formal. "How are your injuries this morning?" "Sore, but no signs of infection." He gestured toward the stove. "There's coffee if you'd like some." They moved through the next hour with polite distance, both acutely aware of the intimacy they had shared, but uncertain how to acknowledge it. Sophia checked his bandages with professional detachment, pleased to see the stitches holding well and no signs of fever. "You should avoid heavy lifting for at least 2 weeks," she instructed, securing fresh bandages around his torso. "And change these dressings daily." Griffin nodded, his face unreadable. "I understand. Thank you for your care." By mid-morning, as predicted, the sun had melted enough snow that the road to town appeared navigable. Griffin insisted on saddling Sophia's horse himself despite her protests about his injuries. "I've worked through worse," he said simply. As she prepared to depart, an awkward silence fell between them. There was so much that could be said, should perhaps be said, but neither seemed able to find the words. "Mr. Thorne," Sophia began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "Griffin," he corrected quietly. "After last night, I think first names would be appropriate." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "Griffin, then. She hesitated, then settled for practicality. "I should check your wound again in a few days, to ensure proper healing." Something flickered in his dark eyes, disappointment perhaps at her retreat into professionalism. But he nodded. "As you wish." Sophia mounted her horse, suddenly eager to escape the conflicting emotions his presence evoked. "Take care with those ribs," she said, gathering the reins. "I'll return on Thursday to check your progress." With that, she turned her mount toward town, refusing to look back, though she could feel his eyes following her until the trees obscured his view. The ride to Northridge gave Sophia time to gather her thoughts, to try to make sense of what had happened. At 43, she had believed herself long past the age of impulsive passion, yet something about Griffin Thorne had awakened feelings she had thought buried with Thomas 15 years ago. But what could come of it? A school teacher with a reputation to maintain could hardly pursue a relationship with the town's most notorious recluse, a man whose very appearance invited gossip and speculation. And Griffin himself seemed content with his solitary existence, his isolation self-imposed as much as socially enforced. No, Sophia decided as the first buildings of Northridge came into view. Last night had been an anomaly, a momentary connection between two lonely souls, heightened by the storm's isolation and the intimacy of medical care. Better to remember it as such than to nurture false hopes of something more. She would maintain her professional demeanor when she returned to check his wounds. She would keep appropriate distance. She would not allow herself to be drawn again into the strange comfort of his presence. These resolutions firmly in mind, Sophia rode into town unaware that forces beyond her control were already in motion. Forces that would make her careful plans irrelevant in ways she could never have anticipated. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity as Sophia juggled her teaching duties with her new role as the town's medical caretaker. Winter illnesses had begun their annual assault, bringing a steady stream of patients to her doorstep. After school hours, children with fevers, an elderly man with rheumatism worsened by the cold, a young mother struggling to breathe properly. She treated them as best she could with her limited knowledge, and Dr. Harrison's supplies consulting her medical texts late into the night and praying her decisions were correct. So far, she had been fortunate. No cases requiring surgical intervention had arisen, and most responded well to basic treatments. True to her word, Sophia had returned to Whispering Pines to check Griffin's healing progress, maintaining a determinedly professional demeanor despite the undercurrent of tension between them. The visit had been brief, clinical, with none of the easy conversation or emotional connection of that first night. If Griffin was disappointed by her emotional distance, he gave no sign, accepting her ministrations with quiet dignity and thanking her formally when she departed. Only once, as she was preparing to leave, did he ask a question that hinted at deeper feelings. "Do you regret it?" He had asked, his voice so low she almost didn't hear him. "What happened during the storm?" Sophia had paused, one hand on the door latch. "No," she answered truthfully. "I don't regret it, but I also don't see how it can lead anywhere given our circumstances." He had nodded, accepting her assessment with the same stoic resignation he seemed to apply to all of life's disappointments. "I understand." Now, nearly 3 weeks after that stormy night, Sophia found herself increasingly distracted by symptoms she had initially attributed to stress and overwork, persistent fatigue, occasional dizziness, and most alarmingly, waves of nausea that struck primarily in the mornings. She was at her desk after school recording the day's lessons in her journal when a particularly strong wave of nausea forced her to set down her pen. She breathed deeply, waiting for the sensation to pass, unaware that Caroline Walsh had entered the schoolhouse until the older woman spoke. "You look pale as a ghost, Sophia," Caroline said, concern evident in her voice. "Are you feeling unwell?" Sophia straightened, composing herself with effort. "Just tired, I think. Between teaching and medical duties, I haven't been getting much rest." Carolyn set a basket of fresh bread on the desk, studying Sophia with narrowed eyes. "That's more than fatigue I'm seeing." She hesitated, then asked bluntly, "When was your last monthly course?" The question struck Sophia like a physical blow. She stared at Caroline, her mind racing backward through recent weeks, counting days that suddenly seemed alarmingly distant. "That's a rather personal question," she managed finally, "and one that needs asking from the look of you." Caroline's tone was kind but firm. "You've been caring for everyone else in town. Perhaps it's time someone looked after you." Sophia's hands trembled slightly as she shuffled papers on her desk, buying time as she confronted a possibility that seemed simultaneously impossible and terrifyingly plausible. At 43, she had assumed certain doors were closed to her, certain experiences forever beyond reach. "I'm in my 40s, Caroline," she said, voicing the thought aloud. "Women my age don't generally—" She couldn't quite bring herself to finish the sentence. "Don't generally what? Get with child." Caroline's practical nature had never allowed for delicacy. "My own sister bore her last child at 45, healthy as could be. Age makes it less likely, not impossible." The room seemed suddenly airless, the walls closing in as Sophia confronted the implications. If Caroline's suspicion proved correct, her carefully ordered life would be upended in ways she could scarcely imagine. Her position in the community, her independence, her future, it all would be irrevocably altered. And Griffin, what of him? A man who valued his privacy and solitude above all else, who had carved out a life carefully separated from society's judgments. How would he react to news that their single night of connection had such permanent consequences? "I can't be," Sophia whispered, though the symptoms suddenly aligned with devastating clarity. "I simply can't be." Caroline's expression softened with sympathy. "There are ways to be certain. My cousin in Cedar Falls is a midwife with experience in these matters. I could take you to her quietly." Sophia nodded mutely, her world tilting on its axis. She had faced many challenges in her 43 years: the loss of her husband, the journey west alone, building a new life in an unfamiliar place. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. What will I do? The question escaped unbidden vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to display. Carolyn squeezed her hand gently. First we confirm, then you decide one step at a time. She paused, then asked carefully, does the father need to be informed? The father. Such a simple term for a relationship of profound complexity. Sophia closed her eyes briefly, seeing Griffin's solemn face, his careful movements, the gentleness that belied his intimidating size. Yes, she said finally. If it's true, he has a right to know. What she didn't say, what she hardly dared acknowledge even to herself, was the fear that coiled beneath her shock. Fear not of Griffin's reaction, but of her own conflicted feelings. For in the midst of her panic and dismay, she had experienced a fleeting but undeniable emotion that complicated everything. Hope. The journey to Cedar Falls took most of a day, made longer by Sophia's need for frequent stops as waves of nausea overtook her. Carolyn had arranged everything with remarkable efficiency: a replacement teacher for 2 days, the blacksmith's niece who had some education, a plausible story about consulting medical suppliers, and a private appointment with her cousin, Mrs. Rebecca Thornton. The midwife's examination had been brief but thorough, her conclusion delivered with kind directness. Sophia was indeed with child approximately 6 weeks along. The nausea should ease after the first few months. Mrs. Thornton advised mixing a tea of ginger and peppermint. This will help in the meantime. Sip it in the mornings before you rise. Sophia accepted the herbs mechanically, still processing the confirmation of what she had already known in her heart. A child, at her age, out of wedlock. The complications seemed endless, the future a fog of uncertainty. You're not the first unmarried woman to find herself in this situation, the midwife said gently, misreading Sophia's stunned silence as shame. There are options if you— No, Sophia interrupted, surprised by her own vehemence. Whatever confusion she felt about the circumstances, she knew with absolute certainty that she wanted this child, perhaps had wanted it in some unacknowledged corner of her heart since the night it was conceived. The child's father is a good man. We will make arrangements. Mrs. Thornton nodded, asking no further questions. She provided Sophia with information about pregnancy care, warning signs to watch for, and herbs that might ease the more unpleasant symptoms. The return journey to Northridge the following day was subdued, Caroline respecting Sophia's need for quiet contemplation. Only as they approached the outskirts of town did she break the silence. Will you tell him soon? Sophia nodded, her decision already made. Tomorrow. It's only right that he knows immediately. And if he doesn't respond well? Caroline asked delicately. The question gave Sophia pause. She had been so focused on the fact of her pregnancy that she had given little thought to Griffin's potential reaction. Would he be horrified, angry? Would he deny responsibility, or perhaps worse, offer marriage solely from obligation? Then I will manage, she said finally, straightening her shoulders. I've built a life once before from the ashes of tragedy. I can do it again if necessary. Caroline squeezed her hand. You're not alone this time, remember that. Whatever happens, you have friends who will stand by you. The words were comforting, though Sophia wondered how many of those friends would remain if the identity of her child's father became known. Small towns had long memories and rigid moral codes. A school teacher with an illegitimate child would be scandal enough. One whose child was fathered by the town's mysterious giant would be the subject of gossip for generations. That night, alone in her cottage, Sophia sat at her small desk, a blank sheet of paper before her. She had intended to write out what she would say to Griffin, to find the perfect words that would convey both the gravity of the situation and her lack of expectations. But the words wouldn't come. How did one prepare for such a conversation? What phrases could possibly encapsulate the complexity of their situation? Instead, Sophia found herself opening the small carved box where she had placed Thomas's locket weeks earlier. The silver felt cool against her palm as she held it. Memories of her first husband flooding back, his gentle smile, his passionate commitment to justice, the future they had planned together before illness stole him away. What would you think of me now, Thomas? She whispered, opening the locket to view his painted face. About to bear another man's child, unmarried, at an age when most women are becoming grandmothers. The painted eyes offered no judgment, no guidance. For the first time since his death, Sophia realized that Thomas had become more symbol than memory, a fixed point in her past rather than a living influence on her present. With sudden decision, she closed the locket and returned it to its box, this time closing the lid firmly. The past was past. Tomorrow she would face Griffin Thorne and whatever future their single night of connection had created. Morning dawned clear and cold, the sky a flawless blue that seemed to mock Sophia's inner turmoil. She dressed with particular care, choosing her best blue dress and arranging her hair neatly. Not because she believed appearance would matter to Griffin, but because the familiar rituals provided a sense of control in a situation where she felt she had none. The ride to Whispering Pines gave her too much time to think, to imagine various scenarios, most ending in rejection or disappointment. By the time the ranch came into view, Sophia's nerves were stretched taut as piano wire. Griffin was in the barn when she arrived, his tall form bent over a workbench where he was repairing a leather harness. He straightened as she entered, the surprise evident in his expression. They had not seen each other since her last professional visit to check his healing wounds 2 weeks earlier. "Sophia," he said, setting aside his work, "I wasn't expecting you." She removed her gloves, slowly buying time as she searched for the right words. "I needed to speak with you about a matter of importance." Something in her tone must have alerted him that this was no casual visit. Griffin gestured toward the house. "Would you prefer to talk inside?" She nodded, grateful for the suggestion. The barn, with its smells of hay and horses, was suddenly making her stomach churn treacherously. They walked in silence to the cabin, Griffin moving with the careful precision of a large man accustomed to making himself less intimidating. Inside, he built up the fire while Sophia remained standing, unable to relax into the domesticity of the scene. "Your ribs have healed well?" she asked, falling back on medical concerns to delay the inevitable. "Yes, thanks to your care." Griffin studied her face, clearly sensing her discomfort. "But I don't think you rode all this way to check my injuries." "No." Sophia took a deep breath, then another. There was no gentle way to say it, no gradual approach that would make the news less shocking. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them, stark and irrevocable. Griffin went utterly still, his expression frozen in a mask of disbelief. "Pregnant," he repeated, as if the word itself was foreign to him. Sophia nodded, watching his face carefully for signs of anger or rejection. "Yes, about 6 weeks along, according to the midwife in Cedar Falls." "Mine?" The question wasn't accusatory, merely seeking confirmation of what he already knew to be true. "Yes." A flicker of irritation broke through Sophia's anxiety. "There has been no one else, not for 15 years. Griffin sank slowly onto a chair that creaked under his weight. His large hands, usually so sure and steady, trembled slightly as he ran them through his dark hair. "A child," he said softly, almost to himself. Then, looking up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "How are you feeling? Are you well?" The question surprised her. Of all the responses she had anticipated, immediate concern for her health had not been among them. "I'm experiencing the usual discomforts, nausea, fatigue. Nothing dangerous." Griffin nodded, absorbing this information with the same careful attention he gave to everything. "And what are your intentions?" There it was, the question that would define their future relationship, whatever form it might take. Sophia straightened her shoulders, determined to present her position clearly. "I intend to have this child," she said firmly. "I make no claims on you, Griffin. I am financially independent and capable of raising a child alone if necessary. But I believed you had the right to know and to decide what role, if any, you wish to play in the child's life." Something flickered in Griffin's dark eyes, a shadow of emotion she couldn't identify. He rose from his chair, moving to the window where he stood silent for a long moment, his back to her as he stared out at the winter landscape. When he finally turned to face her, his expression was resolute. "We should marry." Now it was Sophia's turn to be shocked into silence. Of all possible responses, this blunt proposal was perhaps the last she had expected. "Marry," she echoed. "Because of the child?" "Yes." Griffin's tone was matter of fact. "A child deserves a father and a mother, a proper home, a name." Disappointment washed through Sophia, though she immediately chided herself for it. What had she expected? Declarations of love from a man who had shared her bed once, who had maintained polite distance ever since. This practical suggestion was the honorable response of a decent man facing an unexpected responsibility. "That's very proper of you," she said carefully, "but hardly necessary in this modern age. Many women raise children successfully on their own. Not by choice, Griffin countered. Not when the father is willing and able to provide. And is that what you're offering, financial provision? Something like frustration crossed his features. I'm offering marriage, Sophia, a home for you and the child. Stability, protection, but not love, she said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop it. Griffin's expression softened slightly. I'm offering what I can give with certainty. The rest, he hesitated. The rest may come with time. It was an honest answer, if not the one a romantic might hope for. Sophia found herself appreciating his candor, even as part of her ached for something more emotional, less pragmatic. And you're certain, she pressed. This isn't a life you've chosen, Griffin. You've built a solitary existence here, away from society's complications. A wife and child would change everything. I understand that. His gaze was steady, unwavering. But I also understand responsibility. I will not abandon my child as my father abandoned me. The words contained volumes of pain, a glimpse into the wounds that had shaped this solitary giant. For the first time since entering the cabin, Sophia felt her tension ease slightly. Whatever his reasons, Griffin was offering a solution that would provide security for their child, a not insignificant consideration in a world often hostile to women alone. If we did this, she said slowly, there would need to be clear understandings. I would continue teaching, at least until the later stages of pregnancy. And I would expect to maintain my independence in many matters. Griffin nodded. I would not seek to control you, Sophia. You would be my wife, not my possession. The matter-of-fact way he said it, as if the distinction was obvious, touched something in her. This was a man who had never assumed authority over others, who had lived his life carefully avoiding imposing his physical presence in ways that might intimidate. When she asked the single word signaling her tentative acceptance, soon, Griffin replied, for the pregnancy becomes noticeable. Next week, if Pastor Bennett is available. Sophia nodded, a strange numbness settling over her as the magnitude of the decision began to register. In the space of minutes, her future had been completely redirected. She would become a wife again, a mother for the first time, half of a partnership with a man she barely knew beyond one night of unexpected intimacy. I should return to town, she said, suddenly needing space to process everything. There are arrangements to be made, explanations to prepare. Griffin walked her to her horse, his movements deliberate and careful as always. As he helped her mount a courtesy she didn't need but didn't refuse, he looked up at her with an expression that contained both resolution and uncertainty. We will make this work, Sophia, he said quietly, for the child's sake. For the child's sake, not for love, not for passion, not for the connection they had briefly shared during the storm. Practical words for a practical arrangement. Sophia nodded, gathering the reins in hands that suddenly felt cold despite her gloves. For the child's sake, she echoed and turned her horse toward town, leaving Griffin standing in the yard of what would soon become her home, watching her departure with unreadable eyes. The discovery of Dr. Harrison's journals began as an attempt at distraction. With wedding preparations underway, a simple ceremony scheduled for the following Wednesday, Sophia found herself restless and uneasy, her mind constantly circling back to the life-altering decision she had made. Organizing the late doctor's medical supplies seemed a productive use of nervous energy. Sheriff Montgomery had granted her access to Harrison's office, which remained largely untouched since his death. Timothy, the doctor's young nephew and heir, was staying with relatives in Helena until spring, so Sophia had the cluttered space to herself. The office reflected its former occupant's personality, meticulous in professional matters, but casually disorganized in everything else. Medical instruments were carefully cleaned and arranged in locked cabinets, while books, papers, and personal effects created haphazard piles on every available surface. Sophia began systematically sorting through it all, creating order from chaos. Patient records were filed alphabetically, medicines inventoried and stored properly, instruments checked for condition and usability. It was during this process that she discovered the hidden compartment in the doctor's desk, a false bottom in the bottom drawer revealed only when she removed all the files to reorganize them. The space contained a leather-bound journal and a small locked box. The journal's pages were filled with Harrison's cramped handwriting, detailing observations and treatments, spanning nearly 30 years of medical practice. Sophia was about to set it aside for later reading when a familiar name caught her eye. Thorne. Heart suddenly racing, she examined the entry more closely. It was dated 27 years earlier, before she had even met Thomas, when Griffin would have been only a child of 5. Young Griffin Thorne brought to me today with severe bronchial infection. Clara beside herself with worry. Child size already remarkable, nearly the height of an average 10-year-old, though barely 5. Lungs surprisingly strong despite infection. Responded well to traditional treatment augmented with Clara's herbal preparations. Sophia turned the page, finding more entries about Griffin scattered throughout the following years. Set Griffin's arm today after fall from loft. Remarkable bone density. Clara reports a continued accelerated growth, almost my height now at age 8. Expressed concerns about potential health implications. Research indicates pituitary abnormality possible cause. Griffin, now 12, shows intelligence far beyond typical for his age. Borrowed my copy of Gray's Anatomy. Clara nurturing his interest in medicine. Unfortunate that his unusual size will likely prevent formal medical training despite aptitude. The entries continued documenting Griffin's development through adolescence and into early adulthood. Harrison's clinical observations were interspersed with personal comments that revealed a deeper interest in the boy's welfare than mere medical curiosity would explain. But it was an entry from 17 years ago that truly captured Sophia's attention. Clara revealed truth today about Griffin's parentage. Maxwell Sterling, not the late Mr. Thorne, is the boy's biological father. Abandoned them upon seeing infant's unusual size, declaring the child unnatural. Clara swore me to secrecy, fears Sterling's influence and resources could threaten Griffin if paternity became known. Sterling, now wealthy businessman in Chicago, with political ambitions. Conflicted about keeping such information from Griffin, who continues to believe himself son of a man who died before his birth, Clara insists truth would only cause pain with no benefit. Perhaps she is right. The boy has enough challenges without adding this burden. Sophia sat back, mind reeling from the implications. Griffin had been abandoned by his true father, a man who was still alive, a man named Sterling. The coincidence was too striking to ignore, given Caroline's recent mention of the railroad representative with the same surname. Could it possibly be the same man? The timing would be plausible. Griffin was 32 now, meaning his birth father would likely be in his 50s or 60s, an age consistent with a company executive. Turning back to the journal, Sophia scanned forward and finding scattered references to Griffin's continuing health and development, but no further mention of Sterling until an entry dated just 3 months ago. Troubling news. M. Sterling arrived in territory representing Transcontinental Railway. Cannot be coincidence. Have not revealed connection to Griffin, who remains unaware of true parentage. Clara's dying wish was that boy never learn truth, but Sterling's presence creates complication. Railroad company aggressive in land acquisition methods, questionable according to several patients. Most concerning pattern of illness among holdout landowners. Symptoms inconsistent with natural disease progression. Testing water samples from affected properties. Results disturbing traces of arsenic present in multiple wells. Cannot prove deliberate contamination, but suspicion strong. Sophia's hands trembled as she read. Dr. Harrison had suspected poisoning, deliberate contamination of water sources to force landowners to sell. If true, it was not merely unethical, but criminal, potentially murderous. Further entries documented Harrison's growing suspicions and evidence collection. The final entry, dated just 2 days before the fatal blizzard, contained a chilling resolution. Confronted MS today regarding water contamination. Denied everything but reaction revealing. Threatened to expose evidence to territorial authorities. Perhaps unwise, but cannot remain silent while people sicken and die for corporate profit. Will compile documentation and send to judge in Helena after visiting Morrison Farm tomorrow. The journal ended there, its author's plans cut short by the storm that claimed his life. Sophia closed the book slowly, her mind working to process everything she had learned. Dr. Harrison had died before he could expose potential crimes committed by a company led by Griffin's biological father, a man who had abandoned his son and now threatened the community where that son had built his life. And most immediately relevant, the locked box likely contained the evidence. Harrison had collected evidence that had possibly led to his death if, as the journal suggested, he had confronted Sterling directly. The implications were staggering, the complications multi-layered. Should she tell Griffin about his true parentage, breaking Clara's dying wish and potentially causing him pain? Should she pursue Harrison's investigation, potentially putting herself and her unborn child at risk? And most troublingly, was Dr. Harrison's death truly an accident or something more sinister? Sophia carefully replaced the journal in its hiding place, along with the locked box. She needed time to think to decide the right course of action. With her wedding less than a week away and her pregnancy still in its delicate early stages, the timing could hardly be worse for such revelations. Yet the knowledge sat heavily upon her, impossible to ignore. People might be dying from deliberate poisoning. Griffin was building his life on a foundation of family history that was partially false. And somewhere in Northridge or its surroundings, a man walked free who had potentially committed murder to protect his company's interests, a man who happened to be the father of her future husband. The small office suddenly felt airless and confining. Sophia gathered her things and stepped outside, breathing deeply of the cold winter air. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and rose. Beautiful, peaceful, a stark contrast to the ugly truths she had just uncovered. She would not make any hasty decisions, she resolved. First, she would discreetly investigate whether Maxwell Sterling of the Transcontinental Railway could indeed be Griffin's biological father. Then, depending on what she discovered, she would decide whether to share her findings with Griffin before their wedding. The child growing within her, Griffin's child, complicated everything. In protecting its father, she was now protecting its grandfather as well, for better or worse. The connections between them all formed an intricate web that could not be easily untangled. As Sophia walked slowly back toward her cottage, she was unaware of being observed from the window of the hotel across the street, observed by a man whose expensive Eastern suit and commanding presence marked him as an outsider in the small Montana town. A man whose cold gray eyes narrowed thoughtfully as they tracked her progress. A man named Maxwell Sterling. The wedding dress had belonged to Clara Thorne, carefully preserved in tissue paper and cedar chips for over 30 years. When Griffin had suggested Sophia might wear it, she had been touched by the gesture and secretly relieved at avoiding the expense and fuss of acquiring a new gown on such short notice. Now standing before the small mirror in the church's back room, Sophia smoothed the cream-colored silk over her still flat stomach. The dress had required minimal alterations, Clara having been similar in height, if somewhat fuller in figure. The high collar and fitted bodice were of an earlier style, but still elegant, the simple lines flattering to Sophia's slender frame. "You look beautiful," Martha Walsh said, adjusting the simple veil. Clara would be so pleased to see her dress worn again. Sophia managed a smile, though her emotions were in turmoil. 3 days had passed since her discovery of Dr. Harrison's journal, 3 days of discreet inquiries and careful observation. What she had learned had only confirmed her suspicions. Maxwell Sterling, president of the Transcontinental Railway Company, was indeed the man mentioned in the journal, and therefore almost certainly Griffin's biological father. He had arrived in Northridge shortly after Harrison's death, establishing temporary offices in the hotel and conducting negotiations with landowners throughout the valley. Sophia had glimpsed him only from a distance, a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and cold eyes, impeccably dressed in Eastern fashions that seemed out of place in the frontier town. She had not yet decided whether to share this information with Griffin. Their wedding day hardly seemed the appropriate moment for such a revelation, yet the secret weighed heavily upon her. To begin their marriage with such significant knowledge unshared felt dishonest, a betrayal of the trust they were about to pledge to one another. "It's time," Mrs. Peterson announced, appearing in the doorway. "Everyone's ready." Sophia took a deep breath, pushing her troubled thoughts aside. Today was about creating a foundation for their child's future, about formalizing the partnership she and Griffin had agreed upon. Personal revelations and complex investigations would have to wait. The ceremony itself was brief and understated. Held on a bright Wednesday morning with only a handful of witnesses present. Griffin stood at the altar, looking uncomfortable in his best suit, his massive frame making the church's high ceiling seem somehow inadequate. But when Sophia walked down the aisle, something in his expression shifted, softening from formal resolve to something warmer, more genuine. "You look," he began when she reached his side, then stopped, apparently at a loss for words. "The dress fits well," Sophia replied practically, though she found herself blushing slightly at the admiration in his voice. Pastor Bennett cleared his throat and began the traditional words, speaking of love and honor and commitment until death parted them. When they reached the vows, both Sophia and Griffin spoke their promises with quiet sincerity, though neither met the other's eyes fully. "You may kiss the bride," the pastor announced finally, and for the first time since their night during the storm, Sophia felt genuine nervousness at physical contact with Griffin. His hands were gentle as they framed her face, his touch as careful as if she were made of delicate porcelain. When his lips met hers, the kiss was soft and respectful, lasting only a moment before he drew back. But it was enough to remind Sophia of the tenderness she had glimpsed that stormy night, enough to make her wonder if perhaps this arrangement might indeed grow into something more than mere convenience. The small reception was held at the boarding house, where Mrs. Jenkins had prepared a simple meal for the gathering. Sophia found herself studying her new husband as he accepted congratulations and best wishes from their neighbors. There was an awkwardness about him in social situations, a careful formality that suggested he was never quite comfortable being the center of attention. Yet she also noted the genuine respect many showed him, particularly the working men of the community, the blacksmith, the stable master, the freight drivers. They spoke to Griffin with easy camaraderie that belied his reputation as a recluse. It seemed that while the town's women might find him intimidating, the men had long ago accepted his unusual size as merely another physical trait like height or hair color. It was mid-afternoon when they finally departed for Whispering Pines. Griffin, driving the wagon while Sophia sat beside him, a trunk containing her essential belongings secured in the back. They traveled mostly in silence, both perhaps overwhelmed by the significance of the day and the adjustment that lay ahead. As the ranch came into view, Sophia felt a flutter of anxiety. This was to be her home now, the place where she would raise her child, build a life with a man she was still learning to know. The isolated beauty of the setting struck her anew. The pristine, snow-covered meadows, the stands of pine trees that gave the property its name, the distant mountains purple against the winter sky. "It's peaceful here," she said, breaking the long silence. Griffin glanced at her, a flicker of uncertainty in his dark eyes. "Too isolated, perhaps, for someone accustomed to town life." "I've always valued tranquility," Sophia replied truthfully, "and it's not so far that I can't continue teaching at least for a few more months." He nodded, seemingly relieved by her response. "I've prepared the house as best I could, made space for your belongings. If anything isn't suitable, we can change it." The consideration in his words touched her. Griffin might have proposed marriage from a sense of duty, but he was clearly determined to make her comfortable in his home. When they arrived, he insisted on carrying her trunk himself, despite her protests that it was too heavy. For a man of his strength, however, the substantial box seemed to weigh nothing at all. He set it down carefully in the bedroom, then stood awkwardly in the doorway, as if uncertain of his place in what had always been his own home. "I've cleared space in the bedroom," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "The dresser and half the wardrobe are yours now. I can sleep in the barn if you'd prefer privacy while you're—" He gestured vaguely toward her still flat stomach. "That's not necessary," Sophia replied, though the thought of sharing a bed with this man she barely knew sent her pulse racing for reasons she didn't want to examine too closely. "We're married now. Married couples share bedrooms." Griffin nodded, accepting her decision without comment. "I'll bring in more firewood. The evenings still get cold." Left alone in the bedroom, Sophia surveyed what was now her space as well as his. The furniture was all handcrafted, built to accommodate Griffin's size, but beautifully proportioned nonetheless. The bed was enormous by necessity, its frame sturdy enough to support his substantial weight, with a handmade quilt in a simple pattern of blues and greens. On the bedside table stood a small wooden horse, exquisitely carved, the one she had noticed during her first visit, the memento of Clara. Beside it now sat a fresh carving, a mare with a tiny foal nestled against her side. The sight of it brought unexpected tears to Sophia's eyes. Griffin had made this recently, she realized, a silent acknowledgement of the child they would share. The first few days of their marriage fell into an awkward rhythm of politeness and careful consideration. Griffin rose before dawn to tend the animals, allowing Sophia privacy to dress and prepare breakfast. She cooked and cleaned with efficient competence, treating the domestic tasks as she might any other job requiring skill and attention to detail. She continued teaching in town, riding in each morning and returning in the afternoon. The arrangement raised some eyebrows in Northridge, a new bride spending her days away from home, but most accepted Sophia's explanation that she would complete the school term before retiring to focus on family duties. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, reading, she with her books of poetry and literature, he with farming journals and the Bible his mother had left him. Occasionally, one would comment on something interesting, leading to careful conversations that revealed more about their personalities and values. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Sophia first saw Griffin carving. She'd noticed the wooden horses scattered around the house, small, beautifully detailed figures that captured the spirit of the animals with remarkable skill. But watching him create one was entirely different. "You're very talented," she observed, setting aside her book to watch his large hands shape the wood with delicate precision. "How long have you been carving?" "My mother taught me when I was small," Griffin replied, not looking up from his work. "Said it would help me learn to be gentle with things, to use my hands for creating instead of just working." Sophia could see the truth of that philosophy in the way he handled the knife and the patient care he took with each detail. "What made you choose horses?" "They were the first animals that weren't afraid of me," he said simply. "When I was a boy, some of the kids in town used to dare each other to get close to the giant. Made me feel like a monster sometimes. But horses, they don't care how big you are if you're gentle with them." The confession was quietly offered without self-pity, but it gave Sophia new insight into the man she'd married. She could imagine him as a child, already towering over his peers, trying to find his place in a world that saw him as a curiosity rather than a person. "Children can be cruel," she said softly. "I've seen it in my classroom, the way they sometimes treat anyone who's different." "Did you ever feel different?" Griffin asked, glancing up from his carving to meet her eyes. Sophia considered the question seriously. "Always," she admitted. "Too bookish for most of the girls my age, too interested in ideas instead of gossip. Even in my marriage to Thomas, I sometimes felt like I was playing a role that didn't quite fit." And now, the question hung between them, weighted with implications about their current arrangement. Sophia met his gaze steadily, seeing something vulnerable in his dark eyes that encouraged honesty. "Now I feel like perhaps being different isn't such a terrible thing," she said. "Perhaps it just means I needed to find someone who understood what it was like." Something shifted in Griffin's expression, a subtle warming that made Sophia's heart skip for a moment. The careful formality between them cracked, revealing the possibility of something deeper. "I never thought I'd have a wife," he said quietly, his hand stilling on the carving. "Never thought any woman would want to share a life with someone like me." "And I never thought I'd marry again," Sophia replied, "especially not under these circumstances." "But you're not sorry?" The question held a note of uncertainty that surprised her with its vulnerability. Sophia considered her answer carefully, looking around the simple but comfortable room that was now her home, at the man whose child she carried, at the life they were slowly building together from duty and necessity and perhaps eventually something more. "No," she said finally, "I'm not sorry." The smile that spread across Griffin's face was like sunrise after a long night, gradual warming, transforming his stern features into something almost beautiful. For the first time since their hasty wedding, Sophia allowed herself to hope that perhaps this marriage of convenience might become something neither of them had dared to dream of. Outside, the wind whispered across the prairie, carrying the promise of winter and change and new beginnings that neither of them could yet imagine. The carving knife moved with hypnotic precision, shaving thin curls of pine wood that fell to the workshop floor like delicate ribbons. Griffin worked by the light of a single oil lamp, the rest of the ranch house dark and quiet. It was nearly midnight, but sleep eluded him despite the physical labor of the day. In his large hands, the small block of wood was gradually taking shape, a miniature rocking horse sized for a child's doll rather than a real infant. It would be the first of many toys he planned to create for his son or daughter, a legacy of handcrafted playthings that would show the child it was wanted, anticipated, loved. The thought brought both joy and terror. Griffin had no model for fatherhood, no memories to guide him in this most important of roles. His mother had rarely spoken of his father, saying only that he had died before Griffin's birth, a convenient fiction he now realized to spare a child the knowledge of abandonment. The knife slipped, slightly, nearly cutting his thumb. Griffin set the tools aside, suddenly aware of the wetness on his cheeks. He wiped at the tears with the back of his hand, surprised by their presence. He had not cried since his mother's death 5 years earlier, had thought himself beyond such displays of emotion. "I don't know how to be a father," he whispered into the empty workshop. "I don't know how to be a husband." The fear that had been his constant companion since Sophia's announcement of pregnancy surged within him. Fear of inadequacy, of rejection, of becoming like the father he had never known. What if he failed this child, as so many men failed their families? What if Sophia came to regret their hasty marriage, to resent the obligation that bound her to him. Griffin picked up the small wooden horse his mother had carved for him, the one he carried always as both talisman and reminder. Clara Thorne had been tiny compared to her son, barely reaching his chest by the time he was 15. Yet she had taught him everything of value he knew about kindness, about patience, about seeing beyond appearances to the truth of a person's character. "I'll try to be worthy of your grandchild, mother," he promised softly. "I will never abandon them as he abandoned me." The he remained nameless in Griffin's mind, a shadowy figure, a cautionary tale rather than a real person. His mother had given him no details, perhaps fearing he would search for a man who wanted no part of him. All Griffin knew was that his father had taken one look at his oversized infant son and walked away never to return. A different kind of tears came now, not from fear of the future, but from old pain never fully addressed. Grief for the father he never knew, anger at the rejection. He never understood determination that his own child would never experience such abandonment. "I swear it," he whispered, his massive hand closing around the tiny wooden horse. "I will be there every day of your life. I will never let you doubt that you are loved." The promise spoken in the solitude of his workshop felt like a vow more binding than those he had exchanged with Sophia at the altar. This was not about duty or propriety or social expectations. This was about breaking a cycle, about being the father he had needed, about giving his child the security he had never known. Griffin carefully placed the unfinished rocking horse on his workbench, ready to be completed tomorrow. He extinguished the lamp and made his way back to the main house, moving quietly so as not to wake Sophia. Their sleeping arrangements remained chaste, the enormous bed allowing them to maintain a respectful distance despite sharing the space. Griffin was careful never to presume upon their marital status, to never make Sophia feel that physical intimacy was expected or demanded. What had happened during the blizzard had been mutual, unplanned, a connection neither had sought but both had welcomed in the isolation of the storm. Recreating such intimacy would require equal mutuality, equal desire. As he slipped beneath the covers on his side of the bed, Griffin could hear Sophia's steady breathing, the peaceful rhythm of deep sleep. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, he could see the delicate profile of her face, the dark hair spread across the pillow. His wife, mother of his child, the woman who had seen past his size to the person within. However imperfect their beginning, however uncertain their future, Griffin knew with sudden clarity that he was already falling in love with Sophia Winters. No Sophia Thorne now, not because she carried his child, not because she had agreed to marry him, but because of who she was: intelligent, determined, compassionate, strong. Whether she could ever return such feelings remained to be seen. But Griffin resolved to be worthy of her regardless, to be the best husband and father he could possibly be, to create a home where both she and their child would feel secure and valued. With that resolution firm in his mind, he finally drifted towards sleep, unaware that the peaceful life he was so carefully constructing was about to face challenges from an unexpected and dangerous quarter. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a well-dressed courier who seemed oddly nervous for someone carrying what appeared to be simple correspondence. Sophia accepted the envelope with growing unease, noting the expensive stationery and the unfamiliar return address from a law firm in Chicago. She was alone in the schoolhouse, the children having been dismissed an hour earlier. The growing stack of student essays on her desk awaited grading, but the letter demanded immediate attention, its very presence unsettling in ways she couldn't articulate. The letterhead read, "Blackwood Sterling and Associates," and the contents made Sophia's blood run cold. "Mrs. Sophia Winters, it has come to our attention that you are currently expecting a child out of wedlock, having conceived said child through illicit relations with one Griffin Thorne, a man of questionable character and reputation. Our clients, the estate of Thomas Sterling, have legitimate concerns about the moral fitness of a woman who would engage in such scandalous behavior. As the deceased husband's family holds legal interest in any potential heirs, we hereby demand immediate custody of the unborn child upon birth. Furthermore, should you resist this reasonable request, we are prepared to expose your immoral conduct to the territorial authorities and pursue full legal action to protect the innocent child from your corrupting influence. You have 7 days to respond to this demand. Respectfully, Harrison Blackwood, Escrispama." Sophia sank into her chair, the letter trembling in her hands. Thomas's family, his cold, disapproving parents, and brother who had barely acknowledged her existence during their brief marriage. She hadn't heard from them in over 15 years, had assumed they had forgotten she existed. But somehow they'd learned about her pregnancy. Worse, they somehow believed she was an unwed mother despite her marriage to Griffin. The letter made it clear they had no knowledge of her legal union, which meant whoever was feeding them information was deliberately withholding crucial facts. A second, more devastating realization hit her as she reread the document. The letter referred to legal interest in any potential heirs. Thomas's family had been wealthy, their shipping business providing substantial income and property. If they could claim her baby as Thomas's posthumous child, they would control not only the infant, but also a substantial inheritance. The twisted logic made Sophia feel physically ill. They were claiming a child that couldn't possibly be Thomas's. He'd been dead for over 15 years. But in the chaos of legal maneuverings, truth might not matter as much as expensive lawyers and social pressure. Sophia forced herself to think clearly. The Sterlings were wealthy, influential people with connections throughout the territory. They could afford the best legal representation and had the social standing to make their accusations stick, especially against a woman they could paint as morally compromised. But they were operating on false information. They didn't know about her marriage to Griffin, which meant someone was deliberately feeding them incomplete facts, someone who wanted to destroy her family and saw this as the perfect weapon. Sophia was still puzzling over these connections when she heard footsteps approaching the schoolhouse. Through the window, she saw Pastor Bennett's wife, Rachel, hurrying up the path, her usually cheerful face grim with concern. "Sophia, dear, I have troubling news," Rachel began as soon as she entered the classroom. "A man came to see Oliver this morning, a lawyer from back east asking questions about you and Griffin." "What kind of questions?" Sophia asked, though she already suspected the answer. "About your moral character, your relationship before marriage, whether the baby might not be Griffin's." Rachel's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Of course Oliver told him that you're a respectable married woman, but this lawyer seemed to think you were never properly wed." Sophia felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. What did this lawyer look like? Thin man, well-dressed, with cold eyes. He had papers with him, said he represented the Sterling family from Chicago. "The Sterling family, sigh," Sophia repeated slowly. "Rachel, did you tell him when Griffin and I were married?" "Well, yes, of course, November 15th, just a few weeks ago. Why?" A chill ran down Sophia's spine. If the lawyer had been asking questions after the wedding, he knew perfectly well that she was legally married, which meant the letter threatening to expose her as an unwed mother was deliberately false, a calculated lie designed to frighten her into submission. "Rachel, I need you to think very hard about this. Did the lawyer seem surprised when you told him about the wedding?" The older woman frowned, considering. "Now that you mention it, he did seem taken aback, asked me to repeat the date several times, wanted to know if I was certain. Then he asked some very inappropriate questions about whether the marriage was legitimate or just a hasty arrangement to cover scandal." Rachel continued, her indignation growing as she recalled the conversation. "As if any of that were his business, Oliver told him quite firmly that you and Griffin were properly married in the eyes of God and the law." Sophia felt anger building in her chest, not just at the Sterlings, but at whoever was orchestrating this attack on her family. The same people who were pressuring landowners to sell were now using her late husband's family as unwitting weapons in their campaign of destruction. "There's something else," Rachel said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "After the lawyer left, I saw him talking to that railroad man, the one who's been buying up properties. They seem very friendly for strangers." The final piece fell into place. The Transcontinental Railway Company wasn't just content to pressure Griffin for his land. They wanted to destroy Sophia as well, to leave their unborn child orphaned and vulnerable. By feeding false information to Thomas's family, they'd created a legal nightmare that could drag on for months. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated her. Sophia spent the rest of the day crafting a careful response to the Sterling lawyers. Instead of the frightened submission they clearly expected, she wrote with cool precision, laying out the facts they'd apparently been denied. "Mr. Blackwood, I am in receipt of your letter dated December 14th, and I must correct several significant errors in your information. First, I am not an unwed mother. I am legally married to Mr. Griffin Thorne as of November 15th, 1884, in a ceremony performed by Pastor Bennett of the Northridge Community Church. Witnesses included Mrs. Rachel Bennett, Mr. Stanley Walsh, and Mrs. Caroline Walsh. Second, the child I carry is undoubtedly that of my current husband, conceived within the bounds of our relationship and born of our legal union. Third, any claims your clients might have to this child are not only legally baseless, but morally reprehensible as they concern a child who has no blood relation to the Sterling family. I can only assume that your clients have been deliberately misinformed about my circumstances by parties unknown. I suggest you verify your facts before proceeding with any further legal action that could result in serious professional embarrassment. I remain confident that when the full truth comes to light, your clients will realize they have been manipulated by individuals with their own agenda. Respectfully, Mrs. Sophia Thorne. As she sealed the letter, Sophia felt a fierce satisfaction. Let the Sterlings try to explain to a judge why they were claiming rights to a child that couldn't possibly be their heir. Let them investigate their sources and discover they'd been used as pawns in someone else's scheme. But even as she felt the momentary triumph of fighting back, Sophia knew the real battle was just beginning. The people behind this conspiracy had resources, connections, and apparently no scruples about destroying innocent lives to achieve their goals. She placed her hand protectively over her growing belly, feeling the baby's first fluttering movements beneath her palm. This child would be born into a world where powerful men tried to steal ranches and manipulate the law for profit, where corruption could turn neighbors against each other and tear families apart. But this child would also be born to parents who had learned to fight for what mattered, who had discovered that love could grow from the most unlikely circumstances, and who would move heaven and earth to protect their family. Sophia looked around the simple schoolhouse that had been her domain for 8 years, at the rows of desks where she had taught children to read and write and think for themselves. Soon she would leave this role, at least temporarily, to focus on motherhood. But the skills she had honed here, patience, determination, the ability to maintain order in chaos, would serve her well in the challenges ahead. The war for their family had begun, but Sophia Thorne was no longer the quiet, compliant schoolteacher who had arrived in Northridge all those years ago. She was a wife, a soon-to-be mother, and a woman who had finally found something worth fighting for with everything she had. The storm had been building all day, dark clouds massing on the horizon like an invading army. By mid-afternoon, the light had taken on an eerie yellowish cast, and the temperature had dropped sharply. Frigid air sweeping down from the mountains with increasing force. Griffin worked quickly, securing the barn doors and checking that all animals were safely sheltered. His experienced eye read the weather signs with growing concern. This would be no ordinary winter storm, but a full blizzard, potentially as severe as the one that had claimed Dr. Harrison's life a month earlier. He had just finished reinforcing the chicken coop when he heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Turning, he saw Sheriff Montgomery riding hard toward the ranch, his horse lathered despite the cold. "Thorne," the sheriff called, reining in his mount. "You need to come to town immediately. There's trouble." Griffin's heart seized. "Sophia, is she—" "She's fine for now," Montgomery interrupted, "but there's a situation developing. The railroad men are making accusations. Deputy Miller's talking about arresting you for cattle theft." "Cattle theft," Griffin repeated incredulously. "I haven't bought cattle from anyone in over a month." "Nevertheless, they claim to have found 3 head with the Walsh brand on your north pasture." The sheriff's expression was grim. "Stanley Walsh reported them stolen last week." Griffin's mind raced. The north pasture was rarely used in winter, the snow typically too deep for grazing. He hadn't been there in at least 2 weeks. If cattle with Walsh's brand were indeed there, someone had deliberately placed them on his property. "This is a setup," he said flatly. Montgomery nodded. "I believe so. But Miller's determined to make the arrest claims. He has witnesses who saw you moving cattle at night. He's getting a warrant now." "Why are you warning me?" Griffin asked, studying the older man's face. "Because I've known you since you were a boy, and I know you're no thief," Montgomery replied. "And because this whole business stinks of corruption. The railroad wants your land, and suddenly you're facing criminal charges. Too convenient by half." Griffin glanced at the sky, calculating. "The storm's coming fast. If I ride now, I might reach town before it hits. Sophia's still at the school. Last I saw her, but Thorne—" The sheriff hesitated. "This isn't just about the cattle. There are rumors being spread about your marriage suggestions that it's not legitimate. Someone's trying to undermine both of you." Cold anger settled in Griffin's chest, more dangerous than the approaching storm. Someone was threatening not just his freedom, but his family, his wife and unborn child. For a man who had spent his life avoiding conflict, who had carefully controlled his strength and temper, to never intimidate or harm, the rage he felt now was almost foreign in its intensity. "I'll saddle my horse," he said, already moving toward the barn. "Be careful," Montgomery warned. "Miller's not alone in this. The railroad has men in town, armed men who don't answer to local authority." Griffin nodded grimly. "Tell Sophia I'm coming. Tell her to stay at the school until I arrive." But as Griffin prepared his largest draft horse, the only one strong enough to carry his weight through deep snow, he knew the odds of reaching town before the storm were growing slimmer by the minute. The wind was already strong enough to bend the tops of the pine trees, and the first heavy snowflakes were beginning to fall. He was halfway to Northridge when the storm hit with full force, a white wall of wind-driven snow that reduced visibility to mere feet. Griffin pressed forward, relying on his horse's instincts and his own knowledge of the road. The temperature had plummeted cold, penetrating even his heavy coat. Ice formed in his beard and eyebrows, and his hands, despite thick gloves, grew numb on the reins. A normal man might have turned back, sought shelter until the storm passed. But Griffin was driven by fear, greater than any weather fear for Sophia alone in town with men who meant them harm. He had promised to protect her and their child. He would not fail in that promise, whatever the cost. Meanwhile, in Northridge, Sophia was unaware of the immediate danger. She had remained late at the schoolhouse grading final examinations before the Christmas holiday, oblivious to the brewing trouble until Caroline Walsh burst through the door, snowflakes swirling around her. "Sophia, you need to come quickly," Caroline said, her voice urgent. "Deputy Miller is gathering men to arrest Griffin for stealing Stanley's cattle." "What?" Sophia set down her pen, shocked. "That's absurd. Griffin would never—" "Of course he wouldn't," Caroline interrupted. "Stanley knows that too. Says someone planted his cattle on your north pasture, cattle that went missing last week. It's a setup, plain as day." Sophia rose quickly, gathering her papers. "Where is Griffin now?" "Sheriff Montgomery rode out to warn him, but that's not all." Carolyn's expression grew more troubled. "There's a man in town asking questions about your marriage, claiming it might not be legal, that the child isn't Griffin's." A cold that had nothing to do with the weather settled in Sophia's chest. The Sterling lawyer again. Worse, it's that railroad man himself, Maxwell Sterling. Arrived on the morning stage with 2 hired guns. Been closeted with Deputy Miller all day. Maxwell Sterling, the name that had appeared in Dr. Farr Harrison's journal, Griffin's biological father, though neither Griffin nor Sterling knew that she was aware of the connection. The coincidence of his arrival with these accusations against Griffin couldn't be ignored. "Where are they now?" Sophia asked, already pulling on her coat. "Town hall. Miller's called a special meeting, claiming public safety concerns with the storm coming. But it's just a pretext to gather support for the arrest." Sophia's mind worked rapidly, assessing options. Griffin was likely already on his way to town, possibly already caught in the storm. She needed to delay any arrest until he arrived to prevent him from being ambushed on the road by men expecting resistance. "I need to get to that meeting," she said, buttoning her coat with determined fingers. "Sophia, it's not safe. These men are dangerous. These men are threatening my husband and my child's future." Sophia interrupted, a steel in her voice that surprised even herself. "I will not hide while they destroy everything we built." The storm had reached Northridge by the time they stepped outside, wind howling down the main street with enough force to stagger them. Few people were visible, most having sought shelter from the worsening weather. Sophia and Caroline leaned into the wind, making their way slowly toward the town hall, where lanterns glowed through frost-covered windows. Inside, they found a gathering of about 20 men, including Deputy Miller, Maxwell Sterling, and several of Northridge's business owners. Sterling stood near the front, his expensive Eastern suit and commanding presence marking him as an outsider, despite his attempts to appear at ease. He was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and cold gray eyes that contained none of Griffin's warmth or gentleness. "Mrs. Thorne," Miller said as Sophia entered, emphasizing her married name with slight mockery, "this meeting doesn't concern women. You should be home preparing for the storm." "Any meeting concerning my husband concerns me directly," Sophia replied, removing her snow-covered coat but keeping her place by the door. "Especially when false accusations are being made against him." A murmur ran through the assembled men. Stanley Walsh, who had been standing silently at the back, moved to stand beside Sophia in silent support. "The accusations are not false, madam," Sterling said smoothly, addressing her for the first time. "3 cattle bearing Mr. Walsh's brand were found on your property. The law is quite clear on the penalties for cattle theft in this territory. Cattle that were stolen from Mr. Walsh and deliberately placed on our land," Sophia countered. "By whom, I wonder? Perhaps by those who would benefit most from my husband's arrest and the forfeiture of our property." Sterling's expression hardened, though his voice remained civil. "You make serious allegations, Mrs. Thorne. If that is indeed your proper title, I understand your arrangement with Mr. Thorne was rather hastily concluded." The implied insult hung in the air, its meaning clear to everyone present. Sophia felt her cheeks flush with anger rather than embarrassment. "Our marriage is legal and binding," Mr. Sterling performed by Pastor Bennett before witnesses. "I have the certificate should you wish to examine it." She met his gaze, directly refusing to be intimidated. "But I wonder why a railroad executive from Chicago would concern himself with the marital status of Montana residents. Unless, of course, there were financial advantages to be gained from discrediting us." Before Sterling could respond, the door burst open behind Sophia, admitting a blast of frigid air and the massive form of Griffin, covered in snow and ice but very much present. The assembled men fell silent, many stepping back instinctively from his imposing figure. "Griffin!" Sophia breathed relief washing through her. He moved to stand beside her, his expression dangerously controlled as he surveyed the room. His gaze settled on Deputy Miller, then shifted to Sterling, narrowing slightly as if trying to place a half-remembered face. "I understand you're planning to arrest me, Deputy," Griffin said, his deep voice carrying easily in the suddenly quiet room. "On what evidence?" Miller straightened his hand, moving reflexively toward his holstered gun. 3 head of cattle with the Walsh brand were found on your property, Thorne. Walsh reported them stolen last week." "And did Mr. Walsh identify these cattle as his?" Griffin asked. "I did not," Stanley Walsh spoke up from beside Sophia. "I was simply told they'd been found. Haven't been allowed to see them myself, strangely enough." "Convenient," Griffin observed. "Cattle appear on my isolated property during a period of heavy snow when I rarely check that pasture. No one but the accusers have actually verified the brands, and suddenly I'm to be arrested for theft." "The law must be upheld, Mr. Thorne," Sterling interjected smoothly. "Surely you understand the seriousness of cattle theft in ranching communities." Griffin turned his full attention to Sterling, for the first time studying the older man, with an intensity that seemed to discomfort the railroad executive. "And you are Maxwell Sterling, president of the Transcontinental Railway Company." The older man extended his hand, which Griffin deliberately ignored. "Interesting that a railroad president would involve himself in local law enforcement," Griffin observed. "Almost as interesting as the timing of these accusations coming just after my wife and I refused your company's offer to purchase our land." The standoff might have continued, but at that moment, Sheriff Montgomery entered, stamping snow from his boots. His expression was grim as he surveyed the gathering. "This meeting is adjourned," he announced. "The storm's worsening by the minute. Anyone not already in town should leave now if they hope to reach home safely." "Sheriff, I have a warrant for Thorne's arrest," Miller protested, producing a paper from his coat. Montgomery took the document, glanced at it briefly, then folded it and placed it in his own pocket. "Which we'll keep until after the storm. I'm not risking men's lives to transport a prisoner in a blizzard, especially for nonviolent charges." "This is obstruction," Miller began. "This is common sense." Montgomery cut him off. "Thorne, you and your wife should stay in town tonight. The boarding house has rooms available." Griffin nodded, placing a protective hand on Sophia's shoulder. "Thank you, Sheriff." As the meeting dispersed, men hurrying to secure their businesses and homes before the storm intensified further, Griffin and Sophia found themselves face to face with Maxwell Sterling near the door. "We're not finished, Thorne," Sterling said quietly, his cold eyes moving between them. "Your wife seems to think you're being targeted. I assure you this is merely the law taking its course." "My wife," Griffin replied with equal quietness, "is an intelligent woman who recognizes a conspiracy when she sees one. Whatever game you're playing, Mr. Sterling, understand this, I will protect my family by any means necessary." Something flickered in Sterling's expression. Surprise, perhaps, at being directly challenged, or an emotion deeper and more complex. For a brief moment, Sophia thought she saw a resemblance between the two men, something in the set of the jaw, the intensity of the gaze. Then Sterling's face resumed its mask of cold civility. "Good evening, Mr. Thorne, Mrs. Thorne," he said formally, and stepped out into the storm. In the relative privacy of the town hall entryway, Griffin turned to Sophia, his hands gently grasping her shoulders as his eyes searched her face. "Are you all right? Did they threaten you?" "I'm fine," she assured him, touched by his concern. "But Griffin, this is worse than we thought. They're not just after the land now. They're trying to destroy our marriage to claim our child." Griffin's expression darkened. "I won't let that happen, Sophia. I swear to you." As they prepared to brave the short walk to the boarding house, Sophia debated whether to share her discovery about Sterling's true identity. The timing seemed wrong, with Griffin already facing arrest and their future uncertain. Yet keeping such significant information from him felt increasingly dishonest. "Griffin," she began hesitantly, "there's something I need to tell you about Maxwell Sterling." But her words were interrupted by a sudden commotion outside, shouts and the sound of gunfire cutting through the howl of the storm. Griffin pushed Sophia behind him, instinctively moving to the door just as Sheriff Montgomery burst back in. "Trouble at the jail," Montgomery said tersely. "Someone's trying to break Miller out. I need men I can trust." Griffin turned to Sophia, conflict evident in his expression. "Go to the boarding house," he instructed. "Lock yourself in our room. I'll come as soon as this is resolved." "Be careful," she urged, standing on tiptoe to press a quick kiss to his cheek, the first spontaneous affection she had shown him since their wedding. As Griffin followed Montgomery into the storm, Sophia watched from the doorway, her hand pressed protectively against her stomach where their child grew. The confrontation with Sterling had been merely the opening move in what promised to be a dangerous game with stakes higher than either of them had imagined. The secret she had been about to share would have to wait. The blizzard raged for 3 days, holding Northridge in its icy grip. Streets disappeared beneath towering drifts, and residents who ventured outside did so by tunneling through snow that reached second-story windows in places. The town became an island cut off from the outside world until the storm finally released its hold. Throughout those 3 days, Griffin remained in custody. The attempted jailbreak had been thwarted, but in the chaos, Deputy Miller had managed to serve his warrant, arresting Griffin on charges of cattle theft. Sheriff Montgomery, outnumbered by Miller's supporters and concerned about potential violence, had reluctantly allowed the arrest to proceed, though he insisted on personally overseeing Griffin's detention. "It's temporary," he assured Sophia when she came to the jailhouse the morning after the storm broke. "Once we can get a circuit judge here, we'll sort this out properly." Sophia stood at the barred window separating her from Griffin, her heart aching at the sight of him confined in a cell clearly not built for someone of his size. He sat hunched on a cot that was comically inadequate for his frame, his head nearly touching the low ceiling even in this position. "Are they treating you properly?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Griffin attempted a reassuring smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sheriff Montgomery's been decent. Make sure I get enough food checks that Miller's men don't cause trouble." Sophia glanced over her shoulder to where the sheriff stood, maintaining a respectful distance to give them privacy while still fulfilling his duties. "This is absurd," she said, lowering her voice. "Everyone knows you wouldn't steal cattle." "Evidence says otherwise," Griffin replied grimly. "Miller claims they found tracks matching my horse's shoes leading to the north pasture. Says they have a witness who saw me moving cattle at night." "Fabricated evidence," Sophia insisted. "Sterling is behind this. He wants our land for his railroad." Griffin's expression darkened at the mention of Sterling. "There's something familiar about him," he said slowly. "I can't place it, but when I saw him at the town hall, I felt like I should know him somehow." Sophia's heart skipped a beat. This was the opening she needed to share what she had discovered in Dr. Harrison's journal. But the barred window, the presence of the sheriff, the uncertainty of who might be listening, none of it was conducive to such a sensitive revelation. "When you're released, we'll talk about Sterling," she promised. "There are things I've learned, important things, but not here." Griffin studied her face clearly, sensing the weight behind her words. "Be careful, Sophia. These men are dangerous. If they go this far to frame me, there's no telling what else they might do." "I can take care of myself," she assured him, though her hand moved instinctively to her slightly rounded stomach, now beginning to show beneath her winter coat. Griffin noticed the gesture, his expression softening. How are you feeling, the baby? We're both well, Sophia said, managing a small smile. The morning sickness is finally easing. Mrs. Zhang's tea has been helpful. Mrs. Zhang, the Chinese herbalist in Cedar Falls. She's quite knowledgeable about pregnancy remedies. Sophia didn't mention that she had also been investigating the Transcontinental Railway Company during her visits to Cedar Falls, gathering information that might help clear Griffin's name. Their time was cut short by Deputy Miller's arrival, his boots loud on the wooden floor as he approached. "Visiting hours are over, Mrs. Thorne," he announced, taking obvious pleasure in his authority. "Your husband needs to prepare for his transfer." "Transfer," Sophia repeated sharply. "What transfer to Cedar Falls?" Miller explained with false solicitude. "Better facilities there, more appropriate for such a substantial prisoner. And closer to the circuit judge when he arrives next month." "Next month?" Sophia's voice rose in disbelief. "You can't keep him jailed for a month on unfabricated charges. The law moves at its own pace, ma'am, especially in winter." Miller's smug expression revealed how much he was enjoying the situation. "If you have concerns, take them up with Mr. Sterling. I believe he's still at the hotel." The deputy's deliberate mention of Sterling confirmed what Sophia already suspected: Miller was in the railroad company's pocket, following orders rather than upholding the law. The realization strengthened her resolve to fight back using whatever means necessary. "When is this transfer supposed to take place?" she demanded. "Tomorrow morning, weather permitting." Miller turned to Griffin. "I suggest you rest up, Thorne. It's a long, cold ride to Cedar Falls." After Miller departed, Sheriff Montgomery approached, his weathered face troubled. "I'm sorry, Sophia. The transfer order came from the Territorial Marshal's office. My hands are tied." "We both know who's behind this," Sophia said quietly. "Sterling wants Griffin out of the way while he pressures me to sell our land." Montgomery nodded grimly. "Likely so, but without proof of corruption, there's little I can do officially." "Then I'll find that proof," Sophia declared, "whatever it takes." The sheriff studied her with concern. "Be careful. Sterling's men are watching the town. And in your condition—" "My condition makes this more urgent, not less," she interrupted. "My child will not be born with its father in prison for a crime he didn't commit." Sophia left the jailhouse with determination burning in her chest. She had always been a practical woman, preferring reasoned approaches to emotional reactions. But the sight of Griffin confined like an animal, the casual cruelty of Miller's announcement, the smug certainty that they could separate her from her husband with impunity, all of it ignited a fierce protectiveness she had never experienced before. Her first stop was the Walsh's blacksmith shop, where she found Stanley working, despite the lingering cold, his forge providing welcome heat in the aftermath of the blizzard. Caroline was there as well, sorting newly arrived supplies that had been delayed by the storm. "They're transferring Griffin to Cedar Falls tomorrow," Sophia announced without preamble. "We need to act quickly." Stanley set down his hammer, wiping soot from his hands. "I've been thinking about those cattle," he said. "If they really are mine, they should have my spring branding, mark a notch in the left ear along with the brand. It's how I track which year they were born." "Have you been allowed to verify them?" Sophia asked, though she already knew the answer. The blacksmith shook his head. "Miller claims they've been moved to the impound corral at the edge of town, but whenever I go to check, there's some excuse why I can't see them. Because they either don't exist or were never yours to begin with," Caroline said firmly. "It's all fabrication." Sophia's mind worked rapidly, formulating the plan. "We need to document everything, every inconsistency, every refused request to examine evidence, every connection between Miller and the railroad company. If we can build a case showing corruption—" "It won't help Griffin tomorrow," Stanley pointed out. "The transfer will still happen." "Not if we can delay it," Sophia countered. "Sheriff Montgomery doesn't support this arrest. If we give him justification to postpone the transfer pending investigation—" The conversation continued, strategies proposed and refined. By the time Sophia left the blacksmith shop, the first pieces of a counter-offensive were in place. Stanley would demand to inspect the cattle, documenting any refusal. Caroline would speak with other ranchers who had experienced pressure from the railroad, establishing a pattern of intimidation. And Sophia Villiers would make a calculated visit to the hotel where Maxwell Sterling was staying. The Continental Hotel was Northridge's only accommodation for travelers, a two-story wooden structure with aspirations to grandeur it never quite achieved. Its lobby featured worn velvet furniture and a perpetually smoky fireplace, currently surrounded by several men in city clothes, who fell silent as Sophia entered. The hotel owner, Mr. Jenkins, hurried forward, clearly uncomfortable with her presence. "Mrs. Thorne, this is unexpected. How may I assist you?" "I need to speak with Mr. Sterling," Sophia stated, clearly aware of the listening ears. "It concerns my husband's case." "I'm afraid Mr. Sterling is quite busy with company business," Jenkins replied nervously. "Perhaps if you left a message." "Yeah, my husband is being transferred to Cedar Falls tomorrow, based on false charges orchestrated by Mr. Sterling's company," Sophia said, her voice carrying through the quiet lobby. "I believe that merits a few minutes of his time." One of the men by the fireplace, younger than the others, with a clerk's ink-stained fingers, rose and approached. "Mr. Sterling instructed that he not be disturbed, ma'am. Company policy." "And what is company policy regarding poisoning water sources to force landowners to sell?" Sophia asked, playing her first card. "Or fabricating criminal charges against those who refuse your offers?" The clerk's face paled visibly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Sophia pressed. "Just as I think you know about Dr. Harrison's investigation before his convenient death during the blizzard. The evidence he collected regarding arsenic in well water on properties the railroad wanted to acquire." The lobby had gone deathly quiet, every ear straining to catch the exchange. Sophia had no proof of her accusations, but the seed of suspicion had been planted, and judging by the nervous glances exchanged among Sterling's men, it had fallen on fertile ground. "Mr. Sterling will want to hear what I have to say," Sophia concluded. "Please inform him I'll wait." Her gambit worked. Within minutes, she was escorted to a private dining room at the rear of the hotel, where Maxwell Sterling sat alone at a large table, papers spread before him, and a glass of amber liquid at his elbow. "Mrs. Thorne," he greeted her, not rising as etiquette would normally demand, "you've made some rather inflammatory accusations to my staff. Not wise for a woman in your delicate condition." Sophia remained standing, refusing the chair he indicated. "My condition doesn't affect my determination to see justice done, Mr. Sterling, or my ability to recognize a conspiracy when I see one." Sterling studied her with cold gray eyes so unlike Griffin's warm brown ones. "Conspiracy is a serious allegation, one that requires proof which I doubt you possess." "Perhaps not yet," Sophia conceded, "but Dr. Harrison did. He was compiling evidence of water contamination on properties your company later acquired at reduced prices. Evidence that went missing after his death." Something flickered in Sterling's expression, surprised perhaps that she knew of Harrison's investigation. "The doctor died in a blizzard, Mrs. Thorne. A tragic accident, nothing more." "After confronting you about his findings," Sophia countered, "a confrontation noted in his journal which did not disappear with his other evidence." This was a calculated bluff. While Harrison's journal had indeed mentioned confronting Sterling, Sophia had no way of knowing if such a confrontation had actually occurred. But Sterling's momentary stillness suggested the arrow had found its mark. "What do you want?" he asked, finally, his tone carefully controlled. "Cancel the transfer order. Drop the charges against my husband. Leave our land alone." Sophia listed her demands without hesitation. "In return, I'll withhold the journal from the territorial authorities for now." Sterling leaned back in his chair, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth that contained no warmth. "You overestimate your position, Mrs. Thorne. A journal with unsubstantiated claims is hardly compelling evidence. Whereas the cattle found on your property, the matching horseshoe prints, the witness testimony, all quite solid in a court of law." "All fabricated," Sophia shot back. "And when Stanley Walsh testifies that the cattle bearing his brand lack the ear notches that all his spring cattle possess, your case collapses." For the first time, uncertainty crossed Sterling's face, quickly masked, but not before Sophia caught it. He hadn't known about Walsh's secondary identification method, a detail his henchmen had overlooked in their haste to plant evidence. "One discrepancy won't outweigh the other evidence," Sterling recovered quickly. "And by the time such testimony is heard, your husband will have spent weeks in a Cedar Falls cell. Have you seen the jail there, Mrs. Thorne? Barely adequate for normal men. For someone of your husband's unique proportions, it would be particularly uncomfortable." The casual cruelty of the statement, the implied threat of suffering you deliberately inflicted on Griffin, made Sophia's blood boil. But she maintained her composed exterior, knowing an emotional reaction would only confirm Sterling's belief that he held the upper hand. "Why this vendetta?" she asked instead. "There are other routes for your railroad, other properties you could acquire. Why target us specifically?" Sterling's expression hardened, something personal flickering behind his businesslike demeanor. "The Thorne property sits at a crucial juncture. Without it, we face costly delays and engineering challenges." But Sophia sensed there was something he wasn't saying, something connected to the secret she had discovered in Harrison's journal. Was it possible Sterling knew of his biological connection to Griffin? Had that knowledge fueled his determination to destroy the son he had abandoned? "This isn't just business," she observed. "This is personal for you. I wonder why." Sterling rose abruptly, their conversation clearly over in his mind. "The transfer proceeds tomorrow as planned. If you have evidence of wrongdoing, by all means present it to the proper authorities. Until then, Mrs. Thorne, I suggest you reconcile yourself to your husband's absence. Perhaps consider the generous offer for your property, which remains open despite these unpleasantries." Sophia recognized the dismissal, but stood her ground for a moment longer. "You underestimate us both, Mr. Sterling. This isn't over." "On the contrary," he replied with cold confidence, "it's already decided. Good day, Mrs. Thorne." Sophia left the hotel with her mind racing, processing both what had been said and what had remained unspoken. Sterling had not been intimidated by her knowledge of Harrison's journal, which suggested he believed the most damning evidence had been successfully eliminated. But his reaction to the mention of Walsh's ear-notching practice indicated at least one weak point in the fabricated case against Griffin. More importantly, she had confirmed her suspicion that Sterling's pursuit of their land went beyond business considerations. Something personal drove his actions, whether knowledge of his connection to Griffin or some other motivation remained unclear. As Sophia walked briskly through the snow-cleared streets, she mentally adjusted her strategy. The direct approach had failed. Sterling was too confident in his position to be threatened into backing down. But his confidence might also be his weakness, leading him to overlook details or underestimate his opponents. Her next step was clear, though it carried significant risk. If Griffin was to be transferred to Cedar Falls tomorrow, then Cedar Falls was where she needed to be, not to follow him, but to precede him. Because if Dr. Harrison's missing evidence existed anywhere, it would be in the railroad company's headquarters, where Sterling believed it safely hidden from justice. The journey would be dangerous in the aftermath of the blizzard. The roads remained partially blocked, the temperatures dangerously low. And in her 4th month of pregnancy, Sophia faced additional risks that she would never have considered in normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. Her husband's freedom, their land, their child's future, all hung in the balance. And Sophia Thorne was prepared to risk everything to protect what mattered most. She returned to the Walsh's shop, where Caroline was still organizing supplies. "I need to get to Cedar Falls," Sophia announced without preamble. "Tonight, before they transfer Griffin tomorrow." Caroline looked up sharply. "In this weather, Sophia, it's 15 miles through snow-choked roads. And in your condition—" "My condition doesn't change what needs to be done," Sophia interrupted firmly. "Sterling won't back down. Our only hope is to find Harrison's evidence before Griffin's case goes before a judge." The older woman studied her face, recognizing the determination set in every line. "You believe the evidence is in Cedar Falls? The railroad's regional headquarters is there. If Sterling confiscated Harrison's documentation, that's where he'd keep it, close enough to access but far enough from Northridge to avoid accidental discovery." Carolyn nodded slowly, her practical nature already shifting to how rather than why. "You can't travel alone. The roads are treacherous and Sterling's men will be watching." "I know," Sophia agreed, "but I have a plan." By sunset, that plan was in motion. While Deputy Miller's men watched Sophia's cottage in the jailhouse, believing she would attempt to see Griffin again before his transfer, a humble farm wagon left town by the Eastern Road. Its driver, an elderly Chinese man, attracted no particular attention. Just another local making a late journey home after being stranded in town by the blizzard. Hidden beneath sacks of grain in the wagon bed, wrapped in quilts against the bitter cold, Sophia Thorne began the treacherous journey to Cedar Falls, where she hoped to find the evidence that would save her husband and perhaps discover even more important truths along the way. 16 Cider Falls greeted the dawn with smoke rising from chimneys into the crystal-clear sky, the storm's fury having given way to pristine stillness. The small city of 2,000 souls served as a commercial hub for the surrounding region, its wooden boardwalks connecting two-story businesses that catered to both the local population and the frequent travelers along the stagecoach route. In a small room above the apothecary shop on Willow Street, Sophia woke to the gentle sound of a pestle grinding herbs in a mortar. The journey from Northridge had taken most of the night, the wagon forced to navigate snowdrifts and fallen trees that blocked the road in several places. They had arrived well after midnight, muscles aching from cold and tension, to the welcoming embrace of Meizhang. The elderly Chinese woman had been expecting them, Carolyn Walsh having sent a telegram before the blizzard hit. Now she worked quietly at her table preparing medicines for her day's customers while allowing her exhausted guest a few precious hours of rest. "You awake," Mrs. Zhang observed without turning, her accented English soft but clear. "Good. Tea almost ready. Help baby grow strong." Sophia sat up slowly, her body protesting after the difficult journey and uncomfortable sleeping arrangements. At 4 months pregnant, her midsection had begun to round noticeably, making certain positions increasingly uncomfortable. "What time is it?" she asked, pushing back the heavy quilt. "Just past 7. Mrs. Zhang replied, pouring steaming liquid from a small pot into a ceramic cup. "Men with guns arrive at jail 1 hour ago. Expect prisoner wagon from Northridge soon." Sophia accepted the cup, inhaling the fragrant steam. The tea was earthy and slightly bitter, but she had grown accustomed to its taste during her previous visits to Cedar Falls. Mrs. Zhang's herbal knowledge had proven invaluable for managing the discomforts of early pregnancy. "I need to act quickly then," she said after taking a careful sip, "before they bring Griffin to the jail." Mrs. Zhang nodded, her weathered face solemn. "Railroad office open at 8. Many people come and go. Good time to watch, not good time to enter." "I don't intend to enter through the front door," Sophia replied. The plan she had formulated during the long night journey was risky, but she believed executable with proper timing and a bit of luck. The elderly herbalist studied her with shrewd dark eyes that missed nothing. "Very dangerous what you do, for you, for baby." "More dangerous to do nothing," Sophia countered. "If they convict Griffin of cattle theft, he could hang. I won't let my child grow up without a father." Mrs. Zhang sighed, turning back to her herbs. "Then we prepare. I make special tea, give strength, keep mind clear. You need both today." As she dressed in the simple clothing, Mrs. Zhang had provided garments that would attract less attention than her own more refined attire. Sophia mentally reviewed everything she knew about the Transcontinental Railway's Cedar Falls office. Located in a converted mercantile building on Main Street, it occupied 2 floors. The ground level housed public offices where landowners were received and negotiations conducted, while the upper floor contained private offices for executives and secure storage for company documents. According to Caroline's sources, Sterling maintained an office on that upper floor. When in Cedar Falls, though, he spent most of his time traveling between regional headquarters. If Harrison's evidence existed anywhere in Cedar Falls, it would be in that upper level, likely in Sterling's private office, where he could control access and ensure security. The challenge would be reaching it undetected and searching it thoroughly enough to find documentation that might be deliberately hidden. "You have planned for entering?" Mrs. Zhang asked as she helped Sophia pin her hair into a simpler style than her usual neat arrangement. "The delivery entrance," Sophia explained. "Caroline's cousin works for the laundry service that handles linens for the railroad offices. He's arranged for me to accompany him on today's delivery. The service has access to both floors." Mrs. Zhang nodded approvingly. "Good thinking, but guards watch for unusual people." "I'll be a laundress with a cough," Sophia said, demonstrating a convincing hacking sound. "No one looks closely at servants, especially sick ones they fear might be contagious." The disguise was simple but effective. A plain dress of faded blue cotton, a woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and a large laundry basket that would both conceal her slightly rounded stomach and provide an excuse for her presence. Her hair, normally worn in a neat bun, appropriate for a schoolteacher, was partially covered by a kerchief with stray strands left deliberately untidy. By 8:15, Sophia was walking toward the back entrance of the railroad office, accompanying a young man pushing a cart laden with fresh linens. Jim Walsh, Carolyn's second cousin, had agreed to help with minimal explanation. Needed the Walsh family's distrust of the railroad company ran deep, fueled by multiple attempts to pressure them into selling their strategically located blacksmith shop. "Remember, you've got 15 minutes at most," Jim murmured as they approached the delivery door. "I'll create a distraction in the main office when it's time to leave. Meet me at the back door no later than 8:45. Sophia nodded, pulling the shawl closer around her shoulders and adopting the slightly hunched posture of someone trying not to draw attention. As they reached the door, Jim knocked firmly, the sound echoing in the narrow alley behind the building. A bored-looking clerk opened it, clipboard in hand. "Laundry's early today." "Storm backed everything up," Jim explained with practiced ease. "Trying to catch up on deliveries. This here's my cousin Mary helping out while my usual assistant's down with fever." The clerk barely glanced at Sophia, who kept her face partially averted and gave a convincing cough into her shawl. "Fine, fine, home. Upper floor linens go to the storage closet by the conference room. Don't disturb the meeting in progress." Meeting, Sophia's pulse quickened. If Sterling was in a meeting, his office might be empty, the perfect opportunity to search it unobserved. She followed Jim through the back corridors, helping unload clean towels and tablecloths for the ground floor facilities before accompanying him up the narrow service stairs to the upper level. "Sterling's office is at the end of the hall," Jim whispered as they reached the top. "Green door with his name on it. I'll keep watch from the linen closet. One whistle means hide, two means run." Sophia squeezed his arm in silent thanks, then took a deep breath and stepped into the corridor. The upper floor was quieter than the bustling ground levels, with plush carpeting that muffled footsteps in oak-paneled walls adorned with maps of the region marked with existing and planned railroad routes. Moving with purposeful efficiency that suggested she belonged there, Sophia walked toward the green door at the corridor's end, laundry basket balanced on her hip. She passed several closed doors, from behind one of which came the murmur of multiple male voices the meeting the clerk had mentioned. Sterling's office door was unlocked, a stroke of luck she hadn't dared hope for. Sophia slipped inside, closing it quietly behind her, and took a moment to survey the space before beginning her search. The room was opulently furnished by frontier standards, with a massive oak desk, leather chairs, and a liquor cabinet containing crystal decanters. Maps covered one wall, many marked with notes and calculations. Filing cabinets stood against another wall, their brass handles gleaming in the morning light, streaming through large windows that overlooked Main Street. Sophia set down her basket and moved to the desk first, quickly scanning the papers spread across its surface. Most concerned routine business matters: construction, schedules, supply orders, personnel reports. Nothing related to Harrison's investigation or the accusations against Griffin. The filing cabinets were locked, but Sophia had anticipated this. From her pocket, she withdrew a set of small tools Carolyn had provided, simple lockpicks that the blacksmith's wife had assured her would open most standard cabinet locks. It took several tense minutes of careful manipulation before the first drawer clicked open, revealing neatly labeled folders organized alphabetically. Working methodically despite her racing heart, Sophia examined folder headings, looking for anything related to Northridge water testing or land acquisitions. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness as she worked through drawer after drawer, finding plenty of evidence of the railroad's aggressive expansion plans, but nothing that would help Griffin's case. She was beginning to fear the evidence had been destroyed when she noticed a small safe partially concealed behind a decorative screen in the corner of the office. Unlike the filing cabinets, this would not yield to simple lockpicks, but its very presence suggested it contained items of particular value or sensitivity. Sophia studied the safe, considering her options. She couldn't open it by force, and she lacked the skills to manipulate the combination lock. But perhaps her gaze fell on Sterling's desk calendar, where several dates were circled in red ink. On a hunch, she tried the most recent circled date as the combination 12 to 18 to 84. The safe remained stubbornly closed. From the corridor came the sound of footsteps approaching, then passing the door. Sophia froze, hardly daring to breathe until they faded. She had perhaps 5 minutes left before she needed to meet Jim at the service stairs. Returning to the safe, she considered what else Sterling might use as a memorable number. Birth dates were common choices for combinations, but she didn't know his birth date. Then a possibility struck her: Griffin's birth date. If Sterling was indeed his biological father, he might use that significant date either from sentiment or more likely as a reminder of a past he preferred to keep hidden. From Harrison's journal, she knew Griffin had been born in spring 1852. Trying various combinations of month and date with that year, Sophia felt a surge of triumph when the lock finally clicked open at 04/17/52. Inside the safe lay several folders and a small wooden box. The top folder bore a label that made her breath catch, Harrison Investigation. With trembling fingers, Sophia opened it, finding exactly what she had hoped for. The doctor's meticulous documentation of water samples from multiple properties, chemical analysis showing arsenic contamination, and most damning of all, a record of payments from the railroad company to a supplier of industrial arsenic compound signed by Sterling himself. There was more witness statements from farmers who had fallen ill after refusing to sell a map showing the correlation between contaminated wells and properties subsequently purchased at reduced prices, and a draft letter from Harrison to the territorial governor detailing his findings and suspicions. It was everything they needed to not only clear Griffin, but potentially bring criminal charges against Sterling and his accomplices. Sophia quickly transferred the documents to her laundry basket, concealing them beneath the few remaining linens. As she prepared to close the safe, the wooden box caught her attention again. Something about its craftsmanship, the careful joinery, the polished surface reminded her of Griffin's work. Unable to resist, she opened it, finding a small collection of personal items, a faded daguerreotype of a young woman who could only be Clara Thorne, a lock of dark hair tied with faded ribbon, and most surprisingly, a tiny carved wooden horse, almost identical to the one Griffin carried always. The implications were staggering. Sterling had not only known of his connection to Griffin, but had maintained a collection of mementos related to the son he had publicly abandoned. Whether from sentiment, guilt, or some more complex emotion, he had kept these private reminders of a past he had otherwise thoroughly rejected. Sophia was so absorbed in this discovery that she almost missed the soft whistle from the corridor Jim's warning signal. Quickly replacing the box, she closed the safe and spun the dial, then gathered her basket and moved toward the door. As she reached for the handle, voices approached from the other side, one of them unmistakably Sterling's. "The transfer should be complete by now," he was saying. "Once Thorne is secured in our jail, we can proceed with the next phase." Trapped, Sophia looked frantically around the office. The windows were too conspicuous an escape route, and the space beneath the desk too obvious a hiding place. The decorative screen that partially concealed the safe offered her only hope. She slipped behind it just as the door opened, pulling her basket after her and pressing herself against the wall. Sterling entered with two other men continuing their conversation without pause. "The wife will be more amenable to selling once she realizes her husband's situation is unlikely to improve. I've arranged for his conditions to be particularly, uncomfortable. And if she still refuses," asked one of his companions, "then we proceed with the alternative strategy. The Sterling family lawyers are already preparing their claim on the child. Once that's in motion, she'll have no choice but to cooperate if she wants to maintain custody." Cold fury rose in Sophia's chest at Sterling's casual discussion of using her unborn child as leverage. The man's cruelty seemed to know no bounds, abandoning his own son, then threatening his grandchild decades later, all in pursuit of profit and power. "What about Harrison's evidence?" the second man asked. "If it surfaces—" "It won't," Sterling replied confidently. "I have the only copies secure in my safe. Without documentation, his accusations are merely the ramblings of an old man who died stupidly in a blizzard." The conversation continued, the men discussing logistics of land acquisition and construction schedules. Sophia remained motionless behind the screen, scarcely daring to breathe, her arms aching from holding the basket still. After what seemed an eternity, but was likely only minutes, a knock at the door interrupted them. "Mr. Sterling," called a clerk's voice. "The prisoner wagon from Northridge has arrived. Deputy Miller requests your presence at the jail." "Excellent," Sterling replied. "Gentlemen, shall we witness the arrival of our troublesome giant? I'm particularly interested to see how he adapts to accommodations not designed for his unique proportions." The men departed, leaving Sophia alone once more, shaking with both fear and rage. She waited a full minute to ensure they were truly gone, then emerged from her hiding place. Jim would be waiting anxiously by now, their window for escape narrowing with each passing moment. Moving as quickly as stealth allowed, Sophia made her way back to the service stairs where she found Jim keeping nervous watch. "I was about to come looking for you," he whispered urgently. "Did you find what you needed?" Sophia patted her basket. "Everything and more. But we need to hurry, they've just brought Griffin to the jail." They descended the stairs and exited through the delivery entrance. Without incident, the clerk who had admitted them now occupied elsewhere. On the street, they separated as planned, Jim returning to the laundry with his cart, while Sophia made her way back to Mrs. Zhang's by a circuitous route designed to shake any potential followers. The herbalist was waiting anxiously, relief washing over her face as Sophia entered the small room above the apothecary. "Found what you seek?" she asked immediately. "Yes," Sophia confirmed, carefully removing the documents from her basket. "Proof of everything: the water contamination, the false accusations, Sterling's direct involvement. Enough to free Griffin and potentially bring criminal charges." Mrs. Zhang nodded approvingly, but her expression remained serious. "Good, but dangerous still. These men not surrender easily to justice." "I know," Sophia agreed, sinking into a chair as the tension of the morning caught up with her. "I need to get these documents to Sheriff Montgomery in Northridge. He'll know how to proceed legally." "Not safe for you to travel now," the older woman cautioned. "Sterling's men watch roads. And you," she gestured to Sophia's midsection, "baby needs rest after such excitement." As if in agreement, Sophia felt a flutter of movement within her, stronger than before, a definite presence making itself known. The sensation brought tears to her eyes, at a reminder of all that was at stake. "I can't rest while Griffin is in jail," she said, blinking back the moisture. "If Sterling meant what I overheard, they intend to make his imprisonment as difficult as possible, and they're already preparing legal maneuvers against our child." Mrs. Zhang considered this, her ancient eyes narrowed in thought. "My grandson Lou ride fast horse. Take documents to Northridge tonight under cover of darkness. You stay here, regain strength. Then we make plan to help husband." The suggestion was sensible, but something in Sophia resisted the idea of sending the precious evidence out away with another, even someone trustworthy. "If anything happened to these documents, make copies," Mrs. Zhang suggested practically. "You write clear hand, copy most important papers. Liu take originals, you keep copies safe. 2 chances better than 1. It was a sound strategy. Sophia spent the next hour carefully transcribing the key documents, her teacher's penmanship serving her well, as she created duplicate records of Harrison's findings and Sterling's incriminating orders. By midday, the copies were complete and the originals securely packaged for Liu's journey. Only then did Sophia allow herself to consider her next challenge: seeing Griffin. He was now imprisoned in the Cedar Falls jail under the watchful eyes of men loyal to Sterling. Any obvious attempt to visit him would likely be denied and would certainly alert Sterling to her presence in town. Yet she had to try, not only to assure Griffin that progress was being made toward his release, but also to finally share the truth she had discovered about his parentage. With Sterling actively working against them both, Griffin deserved to know exactly who his enemy was, and why the railroad president's vendetta went beyond business interests to something deeply personal. The risk was substantial. If caught, she might find herself detained as well. The evidence confiscated, their child's future even more imperiled. But the alternative, leaving Griffin to suffer alone, unaware of crucial information that might help him understand his situation, was unacceptable. "I need to see my husband," Sophia said finally, "even if only briefly. He needs to know what we've discovered and what's being done to secure his release." Mrs. Zhang didn't argue, seeming to recognize the determination in Sophia's voice. Instead, she rose and moved to a large trunk in the corner of the room, from which she extracted a bundle of black fabric. "My daughter's clothes," she explained. "She worked as cleaner at jail many years ago before moving to San Francisco. Guards know Zhang family bring food to prisoners every evening. Tonight you go in my place." The elderly woman's resourcefulness continually impressed Sophia. "Won't they notice the difference?" Mrs. Zhang smiled, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Keep head down, speak little. White men think all Chinese look same, not look close at old woman bringing rice." The plan was far from foolproof, but it offered the best chance of seeing Griffin without detection. As Sophia accepted the bundle of clothing, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The morning's discoveries had provided the evidence they needed for legal proceedings, but the coming evening's visit would address an equally important need: maintaining the human connection that sustained them both through this ordeal. In the gathering dusk, as Liu departed with the precious documents securely hidden in his saddlebags, Sophia prepared for her own mission. Dressed in Mrs. Zhang's daughter's clothing, her hair concealed beneath a black head covering, She rehearsed the shuffling walk and deferential manner that might allow her to pass unnoticed among the jail guards. The greatest risk lay in Griffin's potential reaction to seeing her unexpectedly. If he spoke her name or showed obvious recognition, the disguise would be worthless. But it was a risk she had to take. Because beyond the legal evidence, beyond the practical steps toward justice, lay a truth that could not be conveyed by messenger or letter, a truth about family identity and the man who had abandoned a son only to threaten him again decades later. As night fell over Cedar Falls, Sophia followed Mrs. Zhang through back alleys toward the jail, carrying a covered basket containing food for the prisoners. Her heart pounded beneath the unfamiliar clothing, her mind focused on what lay ahead, a brief reunion with her husband, and the revelation that would forever change his understanding of his own past. 17. The Cedar Falls jail stood at the edge of town, a squat stone building with barred windows and a reputation for harsh conditions. Unlike Northridge's small wooden jailhouse, this was a territorial facility designed to hold multiple prisoners awaiting trial or serving short sentences. Its thick walls and iron doors spoke of security rather than comfort, efficiency rather than humanity. Sophia followed Mrs. Zhang closely, keeping her head bowed and her movements deferential as they approached the side entrance used by service providers. The elderly woman had explained that for years her family had supplied meals to prisoners at reduced cost to the county, an arrangement that provided both additional income for her household and the small satisfaction of ensuring that even those behind bars received one decent meal daily. A guard stood at the entrance, rifle cradled in his arms, expression bored but alert. He straightened as they approached, eyeing the baskets they carried. "Evening, Mrs. Zhang," he greeted, his tone casual but not unfriendly. "Right on time as usual." Mrs. Zhang bowed slightly. "Bring food for prisoners. Extra rice today, good for strength." The guard nodded, then gestured toward Sophia. "Who's this, not your usual helper?" "Granddaughter," Mrs. Zhang replied without hesitation. "Other helper sick. She helped tonight." Sophia kept her eyes down, praying the guard wouldn't look too closely at her obviously non-Chinese features in the gathering darkness. To her relief, he merely grunted and stepped aside, allowing them to enter. "Usual rules," he reminded them. "No lingering, no passing messages or contraband. I'll be checking those baskets when you leave." Inside, the jail was dimly lit by oil lamps that cast long shadows across stone floors, worn smooth by years of pacing feet. The main corridor stretched before them, lined with barred cells on either side. Most held 2 or 3 men, rough-looking characters, who watched the women's progress with varying degrees of interest. Mrs. Zhang moved with practiced efficiency, distributing bowls of rice and vegetables to each cell, exchanging few words beyond basic instructions. Sophia mimicked her actions, keeping her face averted from both prisoners and the occasional guard who passed by. They were nearly halfway down the corridor when Mrs. Zhang paused, setting her basket down with a small sigh. "Old bones tired," she announced to no one in particular. "Granddaughter, continue while I rest." It was the signal they had arranged. Somewhere ahead lay Griffin's cell, and Mrs. Zhang was creating the opportunity for Sophia to approach it alone without the older woman's presence drawing additional attention to their interaction. Sophia continued forward, her heart racing beneath her calm exterior. The cells near the end of the corridor were larger, designed for prisoners considered more dangerous or requiring special handling. And in the second-to-last cell, she finally found Griffin. The sight of him made her throat tighten with emotion. He sat on a cot that was comically inadequate for his frame, his broad shoulders hunched to avoid the low ceiling, his expression one of stoic endurance despite what must have been significant physical discomfort. A fresh bruise darkened one cheekbone, suggesting his transfer had not been entirely without incident. As she approached his cell, Griffin glanced up with the same distant acknowledgement that he had given the other food bearers. Then his eyes widened in shocked recognition, his body tensing as if to rise. Sophia gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head, warning him to show no reaction. To his credit, Griffin understood immediately, his expression smoothing back into careful neutrality, though his eyes remained fixed on her with burning intensity. "Food," Sophia murmured, sliding a bowl through the small opening in the bars designed for this purpose. As Griffin reached to accept it, their fingers brushed momentarily, a deliberate contact that sent warmth through her despite the circumstances. "Thank you," he replied, his deep voice carefully controlled. Then, barely above a whisper, "Sophia, you shouldn't be here." She kept her head bowed, pretending to adjust the contents of her basket while responding in equally hushed tones. I had to see you. We found evidence, Harrison's documentation of water contamination, proof of Sterling's involvement. It's being taken to Sheriff Montgomery tonight. Hope flickered in Griffin's eyes quickly, tempered by caution. Sterling has influence beyond Northridge. Even with evidence, it's enough to create reasonable doubt about the cattle theft. Sophia interrupted softly. Enough to justify your release pending further investigation. Montgomery will act once he has the documentation in hand. Griffin nodded slightly, understanding the implications, but his concern remained evident. You took a tremendous risk coming here. If Sterling's men recognize you, there's something you need to know, Sophia pressed on, aware that their time was limited. Something I discovered in Harrison's journal about Sterling, about why he's targeting you specifically. A guard's footsteps sounded at the far end of the corridor, prompting Sophia to move her hands as if merely arranging Griffin's meal. When the steps receded again, she continued in an urgent whisper. Sterling is your biological father, Griffin. He abandoned your mother when he saw your size as an infant, declaring you unnatural. Harrison knew, he documented it in his private journal. That's why Sterling is so determined to destroy you now. You're living proof of his past, a connection he doesn't want exposed. The color drained from Griffin's face, his massive hands gripping the bars with such force that his knuckles whitened. My father is alive. The question emerged as a pained whisper, decades of abandonment issues crystallized in 4 simple words. Yes, and he's using the railroad as a weapon to eliminate what he sees as a threat to his reputation and position. Sophia reached through the bars, briefly touching Griffin's clenched hand. I'm sorry to tell you this way, but you deserve to know the truth, to understand what we're really fighting against. Griffin's expression underwent a series of transformations. Shock, pain, anger, and finally a grim resolution. It explains much, he said softly. The familiarity I felt when seeing him. The sense that his vendetta was personal rather than merely business. He keeps mementos, Sophia added, remembering the box in Sterling's safe. A picture of your mother, a lock of hair, even a carved horse similar to the one you carry. Whatever his public actions, privately, he's never forgotten you. This detail seemed to affect Griffin more deeply than anything else she had revealed. His jaw tightened, emotions warring in his dark eyes. Yet he would see me hang for a crime I didn't commit, would threaten my wife and unborn child. We won't let that happen, Sophia assured him. The evidence will clear your name. And knowing the truth gives us an advantage. He doesn't expect we understand his real motivation now. From the end of the corridor came Mrs. Zhang's voice, slightly louder than necessary, another predetermined signal warning that their time was running out. Sophia gathered her basket, preparing to move on. Be strong, she whispered. I'll get word to you as soon as Montgomery acts on the evidence. This won't be much longer. Griffin reached through the bars one last time, his fingers gently brushing her cheek in a touch that conveyed all he couldn't safely say aloud. Be careful, Sophia. Whatever happens to me, protect yourself and our child first. We'll protect each other, she corrected him softly. All 3 of us. That's what family does. With that promise hanging between them, Sophia continued down the corridor, distributing the remaining food with mechanical efficiency, her mind already turning to the next stages of their plan. The evidence was on its way to Northridge. Griffin now knew the truth about Sterling. All that remained was to wait for Montgomery to act on the documentation and to pray that Sterling didn't discover their counteroffensive before justice could be set in motion. But as Sophia rejoined Mrs. Zhang and they prepared to leave the jail, a commotion at the main entrance drew the attention of guards and prisoners alike. Loud voices, heavy footsteps, the sound of multiple men entering with purpose, rather than the usual measured patrol of the guards. What happening? Mrs. Zhang asked one of the guards, her curiosity appearing natural, though her sharp eyes betrayed her concern. New prisoner, the guard replied dismissively. Some drunk who picked the wrong fight. Nothing to concern yourself with, Mrs. Zhang. You and your helper best be on your way now. Sophia kept her head down as they moved toward the exit, relief beginning to build as they approached the door without incident. But just as freedom seemed within reach, a voice from behind stopped them cold. Wait! The command came from Maxwell Sterling himself, who had just entered the corridor from a side office accompanied by Deputy Miller from Northridge and 2 men Sophia didn't recognize. Sterling's cold gaze swept over the departing women, passing over Mrs. Zhang, before settling on Sophia with sudden sharp recognition. You, he said softly, a dangerous smile spreading across his features. What an unexpected pleasure, Mrs. Thorne, or should I say Mrs. Zhang's granddaughter. Sophia straightened, abandoning the pretense of subservience now that discovery was inevitable. Mr. Sterling, I was just leaving after bringing food to the prisoners, including my husband, whom you've arranged to be held on false charges. Sterling's smile didn't waver as he turned to the guards. Detain this woman. She's attempting to pass contraband to a prisoner. That's a lie, Sophia protested as guards moved to flank her. Search my basket if you don't believe me. There's nothing but empty food containers. The contraband, Sterling continued smoothly, is information. She's conspiring with her husband to obstruct justice and interfere with legal proceedings. Mrs. Zhang stepped forward, her small figure vibrating with indignation. No crime to speak to husband-in-law, allow visits. Authorized visits, Sterling corrected, his tone patronizing. Through proper channels with appropriate supervision, not disguised entry under false pretenses. He gestured to the guards. Take her to the interview room. I believe Mrs. Thorne and I have much to discuss. As the guards moved to grasp her arms, Sophia felt a sudden sharp pain low in her abdomen, a cramping sensation that made her gasp and double over. Fear shot through her, not for herself, but for the child within. The stress, the physical exertion of the journey from Northridge, the tension of the clandestine visit, all of it had perhaps been too much for her own pregnant body to endure. She with child, Mrs. Zhang exclaimed, pushing past the guards to support Sophia. Need doctor, not jail. Sterling hesitated, clearly caught between his desire to interrogate Sophia and the potential complications of having a pregnant woman collapse while in his custody. The momentary uncertainty was all Mrs. Zhang needed to press her advantage. You want child die, she demanded fiercely. Blood on your hands. Newspaper write about railroad man, kill unborn baby. The reference to public opinion struck home as the elderly woman had clearly intended. Sterling's expression darkened, but he signaled the guards to step back. Take her to a doctor then, he ordered curtly. But post a guard. She doesn't leave Cedar Falls without my knowledge. Mrs. Zhang supported Sophia toward the exit, murmuring reassurances in a mixture of English and Chinese. Behind them, Sterling's voice carried one final warning. This changes nothing, Mrs. Thorne. Your husband remains in custody, and the evidence against him is substantial. Whatever you hope to accomplish with this visit, I assure you it will not alter the outcome. Outside in the cold night air, Sophia breathed deeply, the cramping pain already beginning to subside as the immediate stress eased. Mrs. Zhang guided her skillfully through back streets, avoiding the guard who had been assigned to follow them by ducking through a series of connected shops owned by members of Cedar Falls' small Chinese community. Pain still? The elderly woman asked as they finally reached the safety of her rooms above the apothecary. Less now, Sophia admitted, sinking gratefully onto the narrow bed. I think it was just the tension and fear, not anything truly wrong. Mrs. Zhang nodded, her experienced hands already preparing herbs for a soothing tea. Body protests too much excitement. Baby say, slow down, mother. Despite the danger of their situation, Sophia felt a small smile touch her lips. A sensible child already. Like mother, Mrs. Zhang observed with quiet approval. Quick thinking at jail. Sterling not expect woman in your condition fight so hard. The reminder of Sterling sobered Sophia immediately. He knows I'm in Cedar Falls now. He'll be watching for me, and he'll certainly increase security around Griffin. But not know about evidence already gone to Northridge, Mrs. Zhang pointed out. Think you come only to see husband, not steal important papers. It was a valid observation. Sterling had caught her visiting Griffin, but he had no reason to suspect she had already infiltrated his office and obtained Harrison's documentation. As far as he knew, the evidence remained secure in his safe, the combination known only to him. Lou reached Northridge by morning. Mrs. Zhang continued handing Sophia the prepared tea. Sheriff Montgomery have evidence before Sterling know it missing. Then real fight begin. Sophia sipped the calming beverage, feeling the cramping ease further as the herbs took effect. Once Montgomery has the evidence, what then Sterling still has considerable influence. He could delay Griffin's release, create legal obstacles. Evidence not only for sheriff, Mrs. Zhang reminded her, also for judge, for territorial governor, for newspapers. Truth have power when many people know. The strategy was sound. The documentation Harrison had compiled implicated not just Sterling, but the entire regional operation of the Transcontinental Railway Company in serious crimes contaminating water sources, deliberately sickening landowners who refused to sell, falsifying evidence to frame uncooperative property owners. Once such information became public, the company's investors and political supporters would distance themselves rapidly, leaving Sterling isolated and vulnerable. But all of that depended on Lou reaching Northridge safely, with the evidence on Montgomery acting decisively once he received it, on the territorial authorities responding to the proof of corruption and criminal activity. And in the meantime, Griffin remained in a cell built for smaller men, at the mercy of guards who took their orders from the father, who had abandoned him as an infant. Sophia placed a protective hand over her rounded stomach, feeling the child within shift slightly in response to her touch. This baby would be born into a world where powerful men like Sterling used wealth and influence to crush those who stood in their way. But it would also have parents who refused to surrender to such power, who fought with intelligence and determination for justice and truth. Rest now, Mrs. Zhang advised, seeing the exhaustion etched in Sophia's features. Tomorrow bring new challenges. Need strength to face them. As Sophia settled onto the narrow bed, her mind continued to race with plans and contingencies. Sterling would surely increase his efforts now that he knew she was actively working against him. The next 24 hours would be critical. Lou had to reach Northridge with the evidence, Montgomery had to act on it, and Griffin had to remain safe in the interim. Outside the small window, stars glittered in the clear winter sky, the storm long past, and the night peaceful despite the human dramas unfolding beneath its vast expanse. Sophia found herself thinking of the carved wooden horse Griffin carried, always the last gift from his mother, a reminder of gentleness and creativity in a world that often valued neither. And now she knew that Maxwell Sterling, the man who had abandoned his own son and currently threatened their family, kept a similar carving hidden in his private safe. Whatever his public actions, some part of him had never truly severed the connection to the child he had rejected. That knowledge might prove useful in the confrontation that inevitably lay ahead, a confrontation that would determine not just Griffin's freedom, but the very nature of the family they were creating together. With that thought providing a strange comfort, Sophia finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, one hand still resting protectively over her growing child, her last conscious thought, a prayer for Lou's safe journey, and Griffin's endurance through one more night of unjust imprisonment. 18. Dawn arrived with the oppressive heaviness, gray clouds hanging low over Cedar Falls, like a physical manifestation of impending confrontation. From her window in Mrs. Zhang's rooms, Sophia watched the town slowly come to life, smoke rising from chimneys, merchants opening shops, the daily rhythm continuing, despite the dramas that consumed her own existence. The night had passed without further incident. No guards had appeared at Mrs. Zhang's door, suggesting that either Sterling had lost track of her after her escape from the jail, or more likely he was content to let her remain in Cedar Falls, where he could monitor her movements. Either way, the temporary reprieve had allowed her to rest the cramping pains, subsiding completely as her body recovered from the previous day's stress. Tea ready, Mrs. Zhang announced, setting a steaming cup beside Sophia. Good for baby, strengthened mother. Sophia accepted the beverage gratefully, its earthy aroma now familiar and comforting. Thank you for everything. The elderly woman acknowledged the gratitude with a slight nod, her manner practical as always. Lou reached Northridge by now. Sheriff Montgomery have evidence. Next move his. And Sterling's, Sophia added soberly. Once he discovers the documents are missing from his safe. She didn't need to complete the thought. Sterling's reaction to finding himself exposed would be swift and potentially violent. The only question was how quickly he would make the discovery and how he would respond when he did. Their unspoken concerns were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door, not the expected pattern of Mrs. Zhang's grandson returning, but a more authoritative sound that sent a chill through Sophia's chest. Mrs. Zhang moved to answer it, gesturing for Sophia to remain out of sight. The voice that greeted the herbalist was female-cultured and unfamiliar. Mrs. Zhang, I'm Julia Blackwood. I believe you're harboring a friend of mine, Sophia Thorne. Mrs. Zhang's response was cautious. No one here but family. Please, the woman continued, her tone softening. I'm not with Sterling or his men. I'm a lawyer from Helena representing the territorial governor's office. We've been investigating the Transcontinental Railway Company for months. I need to speak with Mrs. Thorne urgently. Sophia stepped into view, making the decision to reveal herself based on instinct rather than certainty. The woman at the door was perhaps 40, elegantly dressed, despite the early hour, with intelligent eyes and a determined set to her jaw that suggested both competence and resolve. "I'm Sophia Thorne," she confirmed. "How did you find me?" Julia Blackwood entered at Mrs. Zhang's grudging invitation, removing her gloves as she surveyed the small room. "Sheriff Montgomery telegraphed our office last night. A young Chinese man delivered some rather explosive evidence to him. Evidence that corroborates much of what we've already gathered about Sterling's operation." Hope surged through Sophia. "You made it through. Then you know about the water contamination, the false accusations against my husband." "All of it," Julia confirmed. "The governor has authorized immediate action. U.S. Marshals are already on their way to Cedar Falls with warrants for Sterling and several of his associates. But there's a complication." Her expression grew grave. "Sterling seems to have anticipated exposure. There was unusual activity at the railroad office before dawn, men loading documents into wagons, others departing on horseback. And there are rumors that prisoners are being transferred from the jail." The implication struck Sophia with physical force. "Griffin, they're moving him again to maintain leverage." Julia nodded grimly. "That's our assessment as well. If Sterling can keep your husband in custody, he retains a bargaining chip regardless of what evidence emerges against him." Sophia moved to the window, scanning the street below with new urgency. "We need to act immediately. If they're transferring prisoners, it will happen soon, likely under cover of normal morning activities before the marshals arrive." "My associates are watching the jail," Julia assured her, "but we're limited in what we can do without official authorization. The marshals won't reach Cedar Falls until midday at the earliest, by which time Griffin could be miles away, held in some remote location where Sterling's men control access." Sophia concluded, her mind racing. "We can't wait for official intervention." Mrs. Zhang, who had been listening silently, spoke up with unexpected authority. "Community help. Many people here not like railroad men, not like how they treat Chinese workers, threaten small businesses." Julia considered this, her professional caution warring with pragmatic recognition of their limited options. A public demonstration might delay any transfer long enough for the marshals to arrive, but it would require rapid organization, and it could turn violent if Sterling's men respond aggressively. "Not violence," Mrs. Zhang corrected. "Confusion, distraction. Many people in street block wagons ask questions, create delay." The strategy had merit. Cedar Falls, like many frontier towns, contained diverse elements, united primarily by their desire for peaceful commerce and mutual prosperity. The railroad company, with its aggressive tactics and disregard for local concerns, had made enemies across various communities. Enemies who might temporarily set aside their differences to oppose a common threat. "It could work," Sophia agreed, hope kindling, "but we'd need to act quickly to spread word without alerting Sterling's men to our intentions." "My Chinese cousins help," Mrs. Zhang stated confidently. "Laundry workers talk to hotel staff. Restaurant cooks talk to store owners. Everyone talk, no one see who start." Julia nodded, professional reservations giving way to practical necessity. "I'll speak with the Merchants Association. Many of them have complained about the railroad's tactics in private, though few have dared oppose Sterling publicly." As the women rapidly formulated plans, dividing responsibilities and identifying key community members to approach, Sophia felt a renewed sense of purpose, replacing the helplessness that had threatened to overwhelm her. This was no longer just about saving Griffin or protecting their land. It had become something larger, a community's stand against corruption and intimidation, a refusal to allow power and wealth to override justice and fair dealing. Within an hour, the carefully orchestrated response was in motion. Messages passed from shop to shop, from household to household, communicated through children running errands, women exchanging recipes, men discussing the weather, all seemingly innocent interactions that gradually spread awareness of the impending prisoner transfer and the need for public presence to witness and potentially delay it. Sophia remained at Mrs. Zhang's, monitoring developments through reports brought by various community members. By mid-morning, the streets around the jail had filled with unusual activity, merchants suddenly needing to move carts of goods, Chinese laundry workers delivering clean linens to businesses on the block, children playing games that somehow always spilled into the road. women stopping to chat in front of buildings that offered clear views of the jail entrance. Nothing that could be definitively identified as protest or interference, yet collectively creating an environment where any attempt to move prisoners would necessarily occur under dozens of watchful eyes and potential witnesses. From her vantage point at Mrs. Zhang's window, Sophia could see the frustration of the guards posted outside the jail, their suspicious glances at the increased foot traffic, their increasingly agitated communications with messengers from the railroad office. Something was happening inside as well, unusual movement, raised voices, occasionally audible, even at a distance. They know something's wrong, Julia observed, joining Sophia at the window. The question is whether they'll risk moving the prisoners anyway or wait for clearer instructions from Sterling. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Maxwell Sterling himself appeared at the jail entrance, his normally impeccable appearance showing signs of haste coat unbuttoned, despite the cold silver hair not quite perfectly arranged. He surveyed the crowded street with obvious displeasure before gesturing sharply to a subordinate. "He's giving orders," Sophia noted, tension evident in her voice. "Whatever he's planning, it's happening now." True to her assessment, activity at the jail increased significantly following Sterling's arrival. Guards emerged to clear space around the rear entrance, using the butts of their rifles to push back curious onlookers. A covered wagon previously hidden in the jail's small courtyard was brought around its driver, looking nervously at the gathered townspeople. "They're still going to attempt the transfer," Julia said grimly, despite the witnesses. Sophia made a swift decision. "I need to be there. If they're moving Riffin, he needs to know we're fighting for him, that help is coming." Before Julia could object, Sophia was already pulling on her coat, her pregnant form no longer disguised by Mrs. Zhang's daughter's clothing, but proudly evident in her own attire. If public witness was their strategy, then her presence as Griffin's visibly expectant wife could only strengthen the moral weight of their opposition. Mrs. Zhang made no attempt to dissuade her, merely pressing a small packet of herbs into her hand. "For courage," the elderly woman explained. "All will see railroad man take mother-to-be's husband. Not look good for his reputation." The observation contained tactical wisdom. Sterling had built his business empire partly through political connections and public goodwill. The image of him personally overseeing the transportation of a pregnant woman's husband, particularly when that woman was a respected school teacher, would not play well in newspaper accounts or political circles. Sophia descended to the street with Julia beside her, moving purposefully toward the jail through the thickening crowd. Word of her presence spread rapidly, creating a path as people stepped aside to let her pass, while simultaneously closing ranks behind her, a human barrier between her and any potential threat from Sterling's men. By the time she reached the cleared area before the jail's rear entrance, a substantial portion of Cedar Falls' population had gathered their collective presence, transforming what might have been a routine prisoner transfer into a public spectacle that would inevitably generate gossip questions and potentially formal investigation. Sterling stood by the wagon, issuing instructions to the guards who were emerging from the jail with the first of several prisoners in chains. His back was to the crowd, his attention focused on the logistics of the transfer rather than its witnesses. It wasn't until a murmur ran through the assembled townspeople that he turned and saw Sophia approaching Julia Blackwood at her side. Recognition followed by barely contained fury flashed across his features. For a moment, Sophia thought he might order the guards to prevent her approach. Instead, he composed himself with visible effort, adopting the smooth manner of the successful businessman addressing a minor inconvenience. "Mrs. Thorne," he greeted her loud enough for nearby witnesses to hear. "This is neither the time nor place for a social call. I suggest you return home and allow the legal process to proceed without interference." "I've come to witness my husband's transfer," Sophia replied, equally audible to the crowd, "as is my right as his wife and the mother of his unborn child." The deliberate mention of her pregnancy caused several women in the crowd to murmur sympathetically. Sterling's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he responded. "Your husband is being moved to more appropriate facilities pending his trial for cattle theft. A routine procedure that requires no audience." "There's nothing routine about transferring a prisoner before the circuit judge arrives," Julia interjected, her professional authority evident in her tone, "particularly when newest evidence has emerged that casts doubt on the original charges." Sterling's gaze shifted to Julia, recognition and calculation evident in his cold eyes. Ms. Blackwood, the territorial governor's watchdog, I was unaware you had business in Cedar Falls. The governor takes a personal interest in cases involving potential corruption of the legal system, Julia replied smoothly, especially when that corruption appears to serve private business interests at the expense of ordinary citizens. The verbal sparring might have continued, but at that moment the jail door opened again to reveal Griffin flanked by guards, his massive frame stooped to pass through the doorway. Heavy chains bound his wrists and ankles, the links thick enough to restrain a man of his unusual strength. Despite this humiliating restraint, and he carried himself with dignity, his expression controlled until he caught sight of Sophia standing before Sterling. Surprise followed by concern flashed across his features. Sophia, he called, his deep voice carrying easily to her despite the guard's attempts to hurry him toward the wagon. You shouldn't be here. It's not safe. I'm exactly where I need to be, she responded firmly, moving toward him despite Sterling's gesture for the guards to intervene. The evidence has reached Sheriff Montgomery. The governor's office is involved now. This won't continue much longer. The guards looked uncertainly between Sophia and Sterling, clearly uncomfortable with physically restraining a pregnant woman in front of so many witnesses. Sterling's frustration was evident as he stepped forward, himself placing his body between Sophia and Griffin. Enough of this spectacle, he snapped. Get the prisoner in the wagon. Now. Griffin's expression darkened as Sterling approached Sophia. For the first time, father and son stood face to face with full awareness of their connection, Griffin having learned the truth from Sophia Sterling, unaware that his secret was known to the very man he sought to eliminate. Don't touch her. Griffin warned, his voice low, but carrying an unmistakable threat despite his chains. Whatever quarrel you have with me, she's not part of it. Sterling turned to face him fully, something unreadable flickering in his expression as he confronted the son he had abandoned 3 decades earlier. On the contrary, he replied coldly, your wife has made herself very much a part of the situation through her interference and disregard for legal procedure. The only disregard for legal procedure, Julia interrupted firmly, has been your company's manipulation of evidence and corruption of local officials. As representative of the territorial governor's office, I am officially informing you that U.S. Marshals are en route with warrants for your arrest and the seizure of company documents related to multiple criminal investigations. The announcement sent a ripple of reaction through the crowd and visibly unsettled Sterling's men. Several glanced at their employer uncertainly, clearly weighing their continued loyalty against the prospect of facing federal charges themselves. Sterling himself betrayed little beyond a tightening of his jaw and a brief narrowing of his eyes. Investigations based on what evidence? The ramblings of a dead country doctor, the desperate fabrications of a woman trying to save her husband from justified punishment. Based on documents recovered from your own safe, Sophia stated clearly, playing her final card. Documents detailing water contamination, falsified evidence, and direct orders bearing your signature. Documents that are now in the hands of both the sheriff and the territorial governor's office. The blood drained from Sterling's brain as the implications registered. His gaze darted toward the railroad office across town, as if he could somehow verify the security of his safe from this distance. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its smooth confidence, replaced by a harsh edge of desperation. Load the prisoner, he ordered the guards. Now! But the guards hesitated, looking from Sterling to the increasingly hostile crowd, from Julia's confident stance to Griffin's imposing presence even in chains. The calculation was visible in their expressions, weighing immediate orders against potential consequences, especially in light of Julia's announcement regarding imminent federal intervention. Sir, one guard began uncertainly. Perhaps we should wait for clearer. I said now. Sterling's composure cracked completely, his face flushing with rage. I will not be defied by my own men. In that moment of unchecked emotion, something shifted in the dynamic between Sterling and those around him. The mask of the controlled businessman had slipped, revealing the ruthless desperation beneath. Guards exchanged glances, townspeople murmured, and even his most loyal subordinates seemed suddenly uncertain of their position. Into this charged atmosphere came the distinct sound of horses approaching at speed, multiple riders moving with purposeful haste. Julia smiled slightly, her expression one of professional satisfaction. That would be the marshals, she observed. Rather ahead of schedule. It seems the governor was even more concerned about the situation than I realized. Sterling's gaze darted from the approaching riders to Griffin, to Sophia, to the watching crowd, calculation and desperation warring in his expression. Then with sudden decision, he reached inside his coat and withdrew a small pistol, aiming it directly at Sophia. "Back away," he ordered the crowd, his voice tight with strain. "All of you, the prisoner comes with me now, or his wife faces the consequences." Gasps and cries of alarm rose from the assembled townspeople, many backing away instinctively from the threatened violence. Griffin lurched forward despite his chains, raw fury contorting his features as he strained against the guard's restraining hands. "Sterling," he roared, "lower that weapon or I swear." "You swear what?" Sterling cut him off the pistol, unwavering. "You'll break those chains, overcome armed guards. Accept reality, Thorne. Your wife interfered in matters beyond tongue.